Sometimes an ordinary Tuesday night can take an extraordinary turn.
How would you react during an armed robbery?
St. Louis, Missouri, August 28, 2019. Berman's Tavern has been in operation since the mid-1930s. The beloved local bar may be old, but it's equipped with modern technology, like surveillance cameras. And those cameras are running at 12:30 a.m. when a patron walks into the bar and turns a typical night into a potentially deadly showdown.
You see this guy come in with this huge gun and threaten everybody, get on the floor. So it's really, really nerve-wracking. It's terrifying because you don't know what's gonna happen. He has a loaded gun.
However, there's one man who doesn't even flinch. He stays right in his seat and casually scrolls through his phone.
He's sitting there with his beer, like, forget about it.
The armed robber notices the one patron who refuses to comply with his orders.
He says, give me your wallet. And he goes, I got $2 in my wallet, and that's for my beer. And you ain't getting it.
Then the robber grabs for his cell phone. But the patron refuses to give it up, even though there's a gun just inches from his head. He yanks the phone right back out of the robber's hands.
He's like, no, I'm not having it. And so you see that it's kind of throwing the guy off because this isn't anything that you expect. This isn't even a normal human reaction. This is a superhero reaction. You can't believe your eyes.
Then the man defiantly lights up a cigarette, showing no fear, even as the patron right next to him empties out his wallet. Who is this man? And why is he unafraid of the large gun in this robber's hands? The man's name is Tony Tovar. He's a 57-year-old master mechanic who lives just blocks away in the South City neighborhood. And bartender Dustin Kruger knows him well.
He's a regular, he's a good friend of mine. I was very surprised by his reaction. I've had guns pulled on me before, but that's the biggest gun that's ever been, put in my face. I went out from behind the bar because I didn't want to be in close contact with him, within feet of the guy with the gun.
If his life is hanging in the balance, Tony doesn't seem to care. Startled and confused at this strange behavior, the armed robber decides to walk away from Tony and goes around the bar to open the register.
While the dude was on the other side of the bar taking money, Tony asked for a beer. He's like, hey, if you're gonna steal from him, might as well steal a beer from me.
And the guy looks at him and he's just like, get your own freaking beer, man. And Tony goes, well, I'm just saying, if you're robbing the bar, rob it a little for me.
But not everyone finds Tony's attitude amusing. Anything could set the gunman off.
To be quite honest, a lot of what was going through my head at the time was whether Tony was right next to me was going to get his brain splattered on me, because he really wasn't doing anything the gunman said.
And everyone in the bar is acutely aware of what might soon be the terrible, tragic conclusion in this high-wire standoff.
Tony's gonna get us all killed. And I know the people next to Tony believe that too. It completely clicked over in our mind that this is what's going to happen. I'm laying on the ground thinking, just shut up, Tony, just stop it. I realize if he's gonna kill one person, he's probably gonna kill everybody in here.
This is a potential bloodbath.
Tuesday nights are usually slow at Berman's Tavern in St. Louis, Missouri. But just after midnight on August 28, 2019, the customary quiet is shattered.
The lone gunman waved what police say was a heavily modified pistol around the room, ordering people on the ground.
As the armed robber paces around the bar, patrons are terrified. They are now trapped on the ground with no way out.
I'm not going to crawl on the floor and try and get out. I'm not going to try and run for the door. I'm not going to try and charge the gunman. At any moment, he could, lose his mind and just start opening up.
But there's one patron who refuses to comply with the gunman's demands, even with a gun in his back. Mechanic Tony Tovar. Not only did Tony refuse to give up his cell phone, but he then lights up a cigarette and starts joking with the gunman.
He really wasn't doing anything the gunman said. He was making wisecracks the whole time.
I'm laying on the ground thinking, just shut up, Tony. Just being like, shut up, just stop it. Tony's gonna get us all killed. I was expecting him to get shot. I was expecting him to die. I was expecting to watch him die. And I'm imagining dealing with the aftermath of people getting shot in my bar because we didn't see any way out of that scenario.
But it turns out, Tony has a totally different read on the situation.
I didn't have any fear. I just realized he was just wanting drug money, and he wasn't out to harm anybody. He really wasn't. He just wanted the money. Because if he wanted to harm somebody, he would have already did it.
Tony reminds me of the person who reaches a certain point where they've had it. They're up to here with bad guys, bullies. Because what we know in the heart of someone who's a bully, who's a bad guy, is they're really very weak inside.
But as the agonizing seconds tick by, Tony's wisecracks do seem to break the tension.
I kind of threw him off guard. He wasn't expecting that. I think that put the whole situation at a little more ease.
It appears Tony's unorthodox strategy may actually be working. The gunman refocuses on getting whatever cash he can from the register. All the while, Tony doesn't stop smoking, drinking, and making comments, even as the man right next to him keeps his hands up.
He forced the bartender to open up the cash register, took the cash out, and even took the coins out of the register. Meanwhile, I'm just shaking my head thinking, well, he missed the tip jar because there was more money in the tip jar than there was in the register.
Other patrons begin to relax as well. Taking a cue from Tony, one even lights his own cigarette. And 5 agonizing minutes after he enters the bar, the gunman finally walks out with $200 cash. And luckily, everyone inside is unharmed. Dustin immediately calls 911. And later that evening, St. Louis police arrest 37-year-old Kevin Moore. He's charged with 4 counts of robbery and armed criminal action. He is currently awaiting trial. The surveillance video goes viral, and Tony's cool-as-a-cucumber performance earns him a new nickname.
He's being called the world's chillest man.
He may be the calmest man under pressure in St. Louis.
The world's chillest man.
In fact, on a morning radio station here in St. Louis, they had people call in and said, is this guy a badass or a dumbass? And 90% of the people said badass.
Although the wisdom of Tony's actions is still up for debate, everyone is thankful a potential bloodbath was averted.
Surprisingly and amazingly, everybody walked out okay. And everybody was okay. And it could have been so much worse. And that's been my feeling from the beginning.
After he had been locked up, he actually wrote a letter of apology to the bar, and they posted it behind the bar on the mirror. I apologize for messing up you guys' evening. I apologize for my behavior, in doing what I did.
And although everything ended well, Tony realizes how badly things could have gone.
If you're not positive and you're not real sure, comply, because you may be harmed. It happened the way it did. We're lucky.
And coming up,
I'm still trying to catch up to it.
Even at 100 miles an hour, you're not gonna get away from the cops.
They're gonna bail, they're gonna bail.
January 19th, 2020, Ozaukee County, Wisconsin. Dashboard cameras on a police cruiser capture a heart-pounding high-speed chase.
With lights and sirens blaring, Bayside police say the driver refused to pull over, instead accelerating at 100 miles per hour.
I'm still trying to catch up to it.
A chase that leads to a horrific collision. It all happens on I-43, one of the busiest highways in the state.
You're potentially putting thousands of people's lives at risk because that stretch of highway goes right into the heart of downtown Milwaukee.
And whoever is behind the wheel clearly has no intention of stopping.
They went through 3 different jurisdictions.
The chase becomes so dangerous, police are ready to do whatever is necessary to stop it.
As you see in that dash cam, there are officers that are just down I-43 at the ready with stop sticks.
Stop sticks, or spikes, are used to force a car to come to an abrupt halt.
There is definitely a danger in terms of throwing the stop sticks down on a busy highway like that in the middle of the afternoon.
These police have to make a split-second decision. Do they let this car continue to go wildly down the road and potentially injure or kill others? Or do they put these spikes in the road?
Police decide to take the risk, and the fleeing silver Malibu hurtles over the spikes at nearly 100 miles per hour. Then quickly loses control and slams into a wall.
You see that car smash into that median wall and then end up flipping over another vehicle.
It's terrifying to watch. But incredibly, whoever is driving still isn't giving up the chase.
I couldn't believe it when I saw it. They just kept going.
Who is behind the wheel? And why are they so determined to get away? It all begins a half hour earlier, when Officer Tyler Taubenheim of the Grafton Police Department responds to a 911 call from a nearby sporting goods store, where a brazen daylight robbery is underway.
The call came out advising that a retail theft had just occurred.
As other officers pursue the suspects, Taubenheim investigates the scene of the crime.
As I walk in, I see the manager first. Me and him walk back to his office where he immediately starts pulling up camera footage. The first thing that stood out is they were very calm. These 2 suspects came in, it was a male and a female. They kind of went here, grabbed a couple things, went there, grabbed a couple of things, and it looked like they were just shopping.
But this criminal couple has no plans of paying for their haul.
It was about 9 minutes total they were in the store. The cashier told me she saw the male and female suspect with armfuls of clothing, and as soon as she made eye contact with them, both of them ran out of the door.
The 2 suspects jump into a silver Malibu and hit the gas.
They are speeding, and they have one mission in mind: getting away.
That's when the terrifying high-speed chase begins. And in no time, the suspects have flown through 3 different towns.
Once the suspects left the store in Grafton, they headed southbound on I-43 and ultimately ended up in Glendale.
Southbound, half-mile north of Silver Spring, to the right to stretch lane, to 100.
Even at 100 miles an hour, you're not going to get away from the cops.
But these suspects don't seem to know that. And not even this horrific crash will stop them. So what will it take to bring this chase to an end?
They're gonna bail, they're gonna bail.
2 thieves make a dramatic getaway from a sporting goods store in Wisconsin, leading police in a wild high-speed chase.
The Bayside police officer reports the getaway car speeding at 100 miles per hour.
but they have no idea their every move is caught on camera.
You should know that when you go into a major store, there are eyes on you everywhere. So it's a pretty stupid decision to just run out the front door with arms full of merchandise.
The chase reaches death-defying speeds of 100 miles per hour.
I'm still trying to catch up to it. We're at probably going almost 100.
There's tons of dangers that come into play with other drivers and innocent bystanders.
Traffic is moving over for me.
People get into accidents. It's very high probability of at least minor injuries, if not more severe injuries or possibly even death.
That's what forces police to put the spike strips down.
Continuing south, he's at 100. He's in the far right lane.
They're going 100 miles an hour into a populated area, and spike strips generally, if everything goes as planned, it deflates the tires, just slows people down.
But it's a risky maneuver, and in this case, it has drastic consequences.
But the suspect vehicle swerved.
Switching over to the center lane.
Runs into the back of another innocent vehicle, which sends that innocent vehicle rolling, and it sends the suspect vehicle into the guardrail. You just see this cloud of smoke and parts and snow. It's incredible to watch, and not a good incredible. The innocent bystander vehicle that the suspects hit, you couldn't tell that it even had a trunk. It was all the way smashed into the back window.
It's amazing, only one other car ended up being hit in this crash. There were 2 women inside that vehicle.
To everyone's astonishment, both women survived the crash.
There were only minor injuries, nobody severely injured or killed.
Then, from the smoke and rubble, the passenger of the getaway car emerges, even as the female driver keeps going.
The suspect vehicle starts free-rolling back into the lanes of traffic. You see the male suspect get out of the passenger seat with his arms up. He's like, nope, I'm done. You caught me.
I'm hurt. All right, we're going to get you an ambulance, I promise you, all right? All right.
But the woman isn't ready to give up.
A female driver is still in the car. The car is still moving. Is she still driving? Is she thinking that she can still get away with this?
I'm with the vehicle, still rolling ahead here.
The police quickly move to box in the badly damaged Malibu and finally put an end to this dangerous pursuit.
Hands up! Get your hands up!
Once both suspects were apprehended, they were transported to the hospital to get medical evaluation.
With the suspects safely in custody, the police retrieved the stolen goods.
And my gosh, it's like a whole aisle of sporting goods right there.
They were brought back to the store where they scanned everything back in, ended up being roughly $1,700.
The value of the stolen goods makes this crime a felony, and police want to see what the suspects have to say about it.
We talked with the female suspect first. She was just very polite, cooperative. It kind of seemed like she just accepted the fact that she got caught. And the male suspect, he just kept talking and talking and talking.
Mind talking to us about what happened in Grafton? I ain't gonna lie, I took a sweatsuit at the store.
He was just like, it wasn't me, I wasn't trying to do it, she made me do it. I didn't believe much of it at all.
The male suspect is identified as 37-year-old Darrell Brown, a repeat offender with at least one prior felony conviction. He is charged with 1 count of felony retail theft. The driver, Latosha Walton, is also charged with felony retail theft, along with 2 counts of reckless endangerment and 1 for fleeing pursuit. And all for just $1,700 worth of clothing and sneakers.
It was all for nothing. Every single piece of merchandise that they grabbed ended up being returned to the store.
Luckily, nobody else got injured. The police stopped these 2, and no one got killed. This is nothing short of a miracle.
I still can't get over it.
It happens just after 4 p.m. on April 25th, 2019, in Middletown, Ohio. A grandmother pulls up to an emergency room with her daughter and grandkids in the car. There's a man squatting near the door who seems out of it. The woman helps her daughter, who hasn't been feeling well for days, into a wheelchair and takes her inside. Just a few seconds later, the strange man approaches the car, jumps into the driver's seat, and floors it, with the grandkids inside.
Sent an officer immediately. Police had a vehicle stolen.
The two young children are just 8 and 10 years old.
I heard them scream, the terror scream of pure fear.
Security cameras capture their grandmother frantically trying to chase the car down.
The grandmother on a dead sprint trying to get control of this vehicle.
Running after the car in sheer panic.
Just like that, a trip to the hospital turns into a nightmare.
So what starts off as a carjacking now is turning into a kidnapping.
It was a life or death situation. If he takes those kids and we don't locate that vehicle, who knows where these kids could have been kidnapped and taken to.
What does this man want, and why has he targeted them?
There's a very good chance they had some pretty nefarious thoughts in mind.
It's a day Nita Coburn will never forget.
It was just the thought that he had them.
When she pulls up to the Atrium Medical Center, she's extremely concerned about her daughter.
When Angie was so sick, she was real sick. I told the kids, you just stay right there, it'll be okay.
As she helps her daughter into the wheelchair, she thinks her grandkids, 10-year-old Skylar and 8-year-old Chance, are safe inside the car.
The kids were in the back seat, and I thought I locked the door, but it wasn't.
Nita is barely inside the hospital door when she hears screams and races back to see what's going on.
At first, I didn't know what was happening. And then when I seen him climbing in my car, it was just terrifying. It was like, I was screaming at the top of my lungs. He had my babies.
Nita immediately dashes after the car. As she approaches, she gets a chilling glimpse of her grandchildren's kidnapper.
He just looked at me and just had this look on his face, a non-caring look. What went through my brain instantly was they were going to be gone and I wasn't going to get them back.
Determined not to let that happen, somehow, Nita manages to hang on to the car door.
I grabbed a hold of the door handle. Car door opened up about a few inches. I was hanging onto the door with both my hands.
For a moment, she has a firm grip on the moving car, refusing to let go.
I was hanging on for their lives. I didn't care about me.
But the kidnapper isn't about to let Nita ruin his plan.
And he just jerked that car door closed again.
As the door handle slips out of her hands, Nita tumbles to the ground. But what she doesn't know is that inside the car, the children are fighting to get out, even as the kidnapper desperately tries to keep them trapped inside.
He had grabbed onto Skylar's hoodie, preventing her from leaving.
As the kidnapper struggles to hang on to 10-year-old Skylar, her little brother, Chance, frantically tries to protect her.
He goes to grab his sister to pull her out, but now the kidnapper is pulling her to avoid that from happening. So now we have a really dangerous situation here, but something the young boy does will change everything.
He's probably the bravest kid I've ever met.
Caught on surveillance video.
Their grandmother tried to chase the driver down.
As a strange man drives off with Nita Coburn's car and her grandchildren, 8-year-old Chance and 10-year-old Skylar, still in the back seat, she frantically tries to hold on to the door, but can't keep her grip and falls to the pavement.
When I went down, I twisted around. I got hurt really bad.
Now, the children share what it was like watching their grandmother from inside that car on a ride from hell.
She was so close to the car, and I figured that she was more than likely going to get ran over. It was really scary, very terrifying.
It all begins when they notice this man lurking outside the entrance to the emergency room.
We parked probably about 2-3 feet in front of him. He had a black bag, and he was smoking a cigarette. And he started walking towards the car, and he said something in a different language, and then he got in the car. and shut the door. I was kind of in shock.
Suddenly, the siblings are stuck in a car with a dangerous stranger, and they have no idea what he wants. Chance is sitting behind the kidnapper. His first instinct is to protect his sister.
The young boy has the wherewithal that, okay, we're in danger, and we need to get the heck out of here.
Chance tries to unbuckle their seatbelts, but the man isn't about to let them go.
I unbuckled my seatbelt, then I opened the door, and when I went to get out, he put his foot on the gas.
To the children's horror, the man also has a tight grip on Skylar.
He had a hold of my arm and my hood on my jacket. He like wrapped his hand around it and was like holding onto it really hard.
As he struggles to pull his sister away from the kidnapper, Chance falls out of the car. But he's not about to let the kidnapper get away with her.
I knew like if I didn't try to help her, I wouldn't see her ever again. And I ran back up to the car and I was holding on to her arm.
He did something that a hero would do, dragging his sister out of the vehicle, pulling them both out to safety.
Not only does this young man have the presence of mind to try to unbuckle, he's also able to successfully fight off his attacker.
Luckily, before he was able to drive off with them, an amazing feat of bravery.
Skylar immediately runs towards their grandmother, who is still in a total panic because she doesn't realize both kids are now finally safe.
All I could think was then that Chance was still in there.
She was crying just because of how scared she was. She was banged up, but she was more concerned about the safety of the two children.
The man is now speeding away. Police chase after him.
That vehicle was a silver 2013 Malibu.
Who is he? And what would have happened if this brave little boy had not pulled his sister out of the car?
Imagine what could have happened. There's a very good chance that girl wouldn't be here today.
Just 10 minutes after the kidnapper flees, police stop him and arrest him.
It appeared that he was in distress. He was extremely indifferent about the incident.
It turns out that Officer Connor Kirby had actually dropped the man, 24-year-old Dalveer Singh, at the emergency room earlier that morning.
The reason being is Dalveer advised that he had been using heroin and that he had wanted some sort of drug treatment. He had already been what he had called heroin sick. He was from India and he had been in Middletown for just a couple days.
But Dalveer doesn't offer any explanation for why he tried to kidnap two children.
He knew that the kids were inside of the vehicle.
It's unclear as to whether or not his motives were looking to kidnap children or someone just looking to grab a car to use that vehicle to further his addiction.
I don't think he understood what kind of impact he's going to have on these kids forever.
But nobody will ever forget what these two brave children did that day.
That 8-year-old now being hailed a hero for saving himself and his sister. The foresight an 8-year-old had to pull his 10-year-old sister out of the car.
It just shows how much Chance loves his sister. He got into a heroic mode and he knew that he needed to do something. He's a very humble kid, but he knows what he did was special. And I always tell him how proud I am of him.
The kid's aunt, who they were taking to the hospital, was treated for an apparent virus and made a full recovery. And they affectionately say that Kirby is now like a big brother to them. He says he's just lucky to know them.
So it's just incredible to see two heroic children.
As for Dalveer Singh, he was charged with 2 counts of kidnapping, felonious assault for dragging Nita, and grand theft, and was sentenced to 11 years. Meanwhile, the 2 kids have been honored for their courage by the city of Middletown.
We went to a Reds game. It was really fun. We were in a parade, 4th of July parade.
But Skylar and Chance don't like to watch the video of the attempted abduction.
It makes me think about it, and it sometimes gives me nightmares.
And their grandmother says they tend to stick close to loved ones now. But she couldn't be prouder of how brave they both were that day.
Skylar, God love her, she kept saying, "It's all right, Grandma, Chance." He's a good baby. I knew he was brave, but oh wow, I was real proud of him.
Seeing Singh in court has been difficult for all of them. But surprisingly, Skylar, who is now 11, says she isn't angry with him.
Everyone makes mistakes. He just made a worse mistake than most people. I forgive him.
Still, knowing how dangerously close they came to losing each other weighs heavily on these tight-knit siblings, who now have a closer bond than ever.
Wow, I'm really proud of my brother for what he did. I saved my sister.
And coming up next, the heroic actions of another brave sibling.
I was very mad. I felt, I gotta get there, I gotta go, I gotta grab him.
Every parent lives in fear of a moment like this.
This is a really unnerving reminder.
And it can happen anywhere at any time.
This is disturbing stuff.
Lawton, Oklahoma, December 26, 2019. It's the day after Christmas, and it's lunchtime at Freddy's Frozen Custard and Steak Burgers. A woman enters the restaurant with 3 children. She's their grandmother. She sits the 2 youngest children down at the table, a 2-year-old boy and a 4-year-old girl. Then, the eldest child, a 12-year-old girl, and the grandmother leave the small children for a moment to go to the counter to get their soft drinks. And when she returns, something shocking happens. Another woman walks over to the table where the 2 youngest children are seated.
The woman behaves in a manner that would maybe let people who were onlookers believe that she knew these children.
And it gets even stranger.
She goes so far as to kiss the children.
But the children don't know this strange woman at all.
Why on earth would a woman approach the children of someone else in a restaurant like this? What's going on here?
After hugging the girl and kissing the young boy, she leaves their table and goes to the counter.
The kind of behavior she exhibits, there's clearly something wrong with her.
The children's grandmother seems confused. Could this be someone who knows her grandchildren? But she's about to find out that the strange woman has more sinister intentions. When her back is turned, the woman returns to the table and does the unthinkable. She snatches the 2-year-old boy. A call goes out to 911.
Employees saw everything, and an officer is going to be dispatched.
90 from here and out to Freddy's.
Just a few miles away, the children's mother, Crystal Phillips, is hard at work. She hasn't been able to get to her phone in hours.
It was the day after Christmas. I work at the hospital. I get a few calls, but I can't check it because, we're really busy.
She doesn't yet know she's already received the call every mother dreads.
So on my downtime, I saw my phone and I got 3 missed calls, one from my daughter, one from my mom, one from my husband. And so finally, when I'm able to call back, my mom answers frantically, "Someone tried to take your child."
I'm not gonna lie, the Southern rage just took over. I was hot. It was just a total shock factor. It was like, how does this happen?
Crystal and Stedman immediately leave their respective places of work and race to the restaurant.
I didn't need to hear anything else. I just imagined the worst. You see news stories of child abduction. It's kind of like every mom's worst fear.
The worst part for me was not being able to be there for them, because my biggest thing is, as a dad, that's your #1 job, is protect the kids. That's all I'm here for.
Who is this woman, and what does she want with their son?
Abduction is probably one of the scariest things that any of us, and especially any of us who are parents, could ever imagine. Often, abductions result in permanent tragedy.
Watch the top left of your screen there. Police say the strange woman walked up and just tried to take that child.
A female walked in, reached over and grabbed a 2-year-old boy from his car seat at the table.
December 26, 2019 starts like any other day for 12-year-old Michaela Phillips. It's the day after Christmas, and Michaela's parents, Crystal and Stedman, are already back at work. Michaela and her 2 siblings, her 2-year-old brother Brett, and her 4-year-old sister Ariana spend the day with their grandmother.
We were just chilling with my grandma, just riding around, having fun, because she wanted to get us out of the house.
she takes the 3 children to Freddy's Frozen Custard and Steak Burgers on Cash Road.
We went in, and then me and her went to go get drinks for my little brother and sister and us. And I went to go get straws.
That's when Michaela notices the strange woman watching her and her 2-year-old brother.
She didn't seem right. She just didn't look like she was all there. She didn't look normal. Give them both a hug and kiss both of them. I was like, that's weird. Like, people don't kiss other people's kids. Then when she picked up my brother, she was saying that it was her baby. My brother, he didn't really know what was happening.
But before the woman can leave the restaurant with the small child, Michaela springs into action.
When she picked up my brother, she was saying that it was her baby, and I just kept yelling back that it was my brother and it wasn't her baby, and that she needs to stop touching my brother.
Then, Michaela does something brave. She tries to save her little brother.
I was very mad. I felt like, I gotta get there, I gotta go, I gotta grab him.
Michaela literally pulls Brett out of the woman's arms.
She started yelling at me that it was her son and to give him back, but I started yelling back that she needs to stop touching my brother, and I told her that if she touched him again, we were gonna have problems.
Her quick thinking and decisive actions buy enough time for her grandmother and a waitress to come to his rescue. At last, he is safe. When Michaela's relieved parents arrive at the restaurant, managers replay the chilling footage to show them exactly what happened to their children.
He showed me the video and I recorded it on my phone. That was just like crushing to me. So the fact that she picked him up like that was a lot of force to use. That wasn't just a hug. She used force to pick him up. That's when I understood that this woman is not mentally stable. And I don't know if that made me feel better or terrified me more.
But the video also shows her just how brave her daughter Michaela really was.
She's always been like that, though. She's a protective person by nature. She'll stick up for anyone. She'll, protect anyone. That's just how she is.
This is my tomboy. Just like her father, she won't cry or anything.
The strange woman leaves the restaurant still unidentified. So many questions linger. Who is this woman? What does she want with a 2-year-old boy? And where did she plan to take him?
The thing that was really bad was the restaurant's right next to a freeway. So if she would have just made out the door, we don't know what was going to happen there.
Who knows what could have happened? My worst fear is that it means she was homeless, that if she took him, I wouldn't be able to find him. If she's living on the street, there's no known addresses to hunt down. Where would I even start looking?
1 week later, police finally identify the mysterious woman who tried to snatch 2-year-old Brett Phillips, Michelle Renee Litton. A warrant is issued for her arrest for a felony count of forcibly taking away a child. She is taken into custody on January 2nd, 2020.
But when they caught her, I felt better. But I try not to think about it because it's my baby brother.
It turns out Michelle Renee Litton has had multiple prior interactions with law enforcement and suffers from mental illness.
I feel like she does need help, 100%. I don't think she was purposely targeting him. I think she was just looking for a little boy, to replace her son that she said she had.
She's not cognizant of what was going on. So her sitting in jail, I feel like that's not going to do anything. Let's honestly get her help and let's get her off the street, rehabilitate her. There's gonna be a lot more positivity towards her and towards, everyone.
Despite their young son's agonizing brush with danger, Stedman and Crystal are relieved to know there's someone in their family who won't hesitate to do the right thing.
Oh, I'm so proud. I'm so proud of her. I have these 2 little kids and, I worry about them, but, knowing that she has the ability to protect them when I'm not there, I'm very grateful for that.
Did a great job, Princess.
I'm always impressed when people act. In the absence of assistance, they act. And because of their actions, tragedy is averted. Courage and bravery. And again, In this case, this 12-year-old girl's actions, very likely she saved her brother's life.
The call came in just after midnight. Not a scream, not a gunshot, just a quiet voice on the line, shaking, unsure, almost whispering as if the darkness itself might be listening. A woman in rural Ohio reported something strange on a narrow county road outside town. A car sitting alone with its headlights still burning, engine silent, driver's door hanging open like a question no one wanted to answer. Within minutes, red and blue lights cut through the cold October air. What deputies found that night would become one of Ohio's most haunting mysteries, a case that would sit unsolved for years, whispered about in diners, argued over in police briefings, and eventually filed away under two words investigators hate more than anything else: cold case. The town of Millbrook, Ohio, was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked. Population barely over 7,000. One main street, two churches across from each other, a grocery store that closed at 8 sharp. The kind of place where everyone knew whose truck was parked outside the diner before they even walked in. Nothing ever happened here until October 12, 1997. The car found on that empty road belonged to 26-year-old Daniel Mercer. Daniel wasn't the type to vanish. He worked as a mechanic at his uncle's auto shop just outside town, the kind of guy who could rebuild an engine blindfolded and still have grease on his hands after 3 showers. Friends described him as quiet but dependable. Family described him as stubborn but loyal. The night he disappeared, he had finished a late shift at the garage. Around 9:40 p.m., he locked up, waved to a coworker, and climbed into his dark green pickup truck. It was supposed to be a 15-minute drive home. He never made it. When deputies approached the truck, the first thing they noticed was the silence. The engine had cooled. The radio was still on low, crackling faintly with a country station fading in and out. Daniel's wallet sat on the passenger seat, keys still in the ignition. But Daniel Mercer was gone. There were no signs of a struggle. No broken glass. No blood. Just one strange detail investigators would replay again and again in their minds. The driver's door was open, and the interior light was still glowing softly in the dark. As if someone had stepped out for just a moment, deputies searched the roadside ditch. They swept flashlights through nearby fields. Nothing. No footprints. No drag marks. No dropped belongings. It was as if Daniel Mercer had stepped out of his truck and then simply vanished into the Ohio night. By sunrise, the entire town knew. Millbrook woke up to flashing police lights and yellow tape along County Road 17. People whispered over coffee at the diner. Farmers slowed their trucks to stare as they passed the scene. Because this wasn't just another missing person. This was Daniel Mercer. And people in Millbrook didn't just disappear. Search teams combed the area for 2 straight days. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through tall autumn grass. Dogs tracked Daniel's scent from the truck to the edge of the road, and then stopped, like the trail had been erased. Investigators considered the possibilities. Car trouble? No. The truck was perfectly functional. A medical emergency? Unlikely. No signs Daniel had collapsed nearby. A random attack? Maybe. But there was no evidence anyone else had even been there. Then came the first unsettling detail. A farmer who lived half a mile down the road told deputies he had heard something unusual that night. Not a crash. Not a scream. Just a car driving fast down the road around 10 p.m. Too fast for that quiet stretch of pavement. When investigators asked if he had seen headlights, he shook his head. No. What he remembered was stranger. He remembered a car driving with its headlights off. The detail sent a ripple through the investigation. Why would someone speed down a dark country road with no lights? Was it coincidence? Or was someone leaving the scene of something terrible? Days passed. Then weeks. The search widened beyond Millbrook. State investigators joined the case. Daniel's photo appeared on missing person posters across Ohio. Still nothing. No sightings. No phone calls. No ransom demands. Just silence. The kind of silence that slowly turns a missing person case into something far worse. Months later, the case took its first disturbing turn. A fisherman discovered something along the banks of the Scioto River nearly 30 miles away. It was a single work glove, grease-stained, worn leather, the exact kind Daniel Mercer wore every day at the auto shop. Investigators tested it. No doubt, the glove belonged to Daniel. But the discovery raised more questions than answers. How did it get there? Why only one glove? And if Daniel had been taken, why leave behind a single piece of evidence miles away? Detectives began quietly exploring darker possibilities. Kidnapping, robbery, personal conflict. They dug into Daniel's life. Coworkers, friends, old arguments, anyone who might have had a reason to hurt him. But everyone told the same story. Daniel Mercer didn't have enemies. He worked. He went home. He spent weekends helping his father fix up an old fishing boat. Nothing about his life suggested danger, which made his disappearance even more unsettling. Because if no one wanted to harm Daniel Mercer, then who did? And why? The case slowly cooled. Tips dried up. Search efforts faded. The posters on telephone poles began peeling under Ohio rain and winter snow. Eventually, the file was labeled with the words detectives dread. Unsolved. But the story of Daniel Mercer never completely disappeared in Millbrook. People talked about it for years. Some believed he had been abducted by a stranger passing through town. Others whispered darker theories. Late-night arguments at the diner often circled back to the same unsettling thought. What if whoever took Daniel lived right there in Millbrook? What if the person responsible had been watching the investigation unfold the entire time, living quietly among neighbors, waiting for everyone to forget? And eventually most people did, until 25 years later. A retired detective picked up the file again and noticed something everyone else had missed. Something small, something buried in old notes from 1997. A detail that would reopen the case and shake the quiet town of Millbrook all over again. Because sometimes the truth doesn't disappear. Sometimes it just waits, hidden in plain sight, for decades, until someone finally looks closely enough to see it. The file had been sitting in a gray metal cabinet for more than 2 decades, buried beneath layers of dust and forgotten paperwork, its edges yellowed, its pages thick with the silence of unanswered questions. Most detectives who passed through the department had seen the label once or twice. Mercer, Daniel. Missing. 1997. Cold case. For years it had been little more than a ghost in the records room, a reminder that not every story gets an ending. But on a quiet winter morning 25 years later, one man decided to open it again. His name was Thomas Keller. Keller had spent 32 years working homicides across central Ohio. He had chased killers through snowstorms, interrogated suspects in dim interrogation rooms long past midnight, and stood in courtrooms listening to juries deliver verdicts that sometimes felt like justice and sometimes didn't. By the time he retired, Keller had seen enough crime to understand a simple truth most people never learn. The past never stays buried. It waits, patiently. When Keller first worked the Mercer case back in 1997, he had been a young detective assigned to assist the county sheriff's office. He remembered the night clearly, the cold air, the lonely road, the strange stillness around the abandoned pickup truck. He remembered searching the roadside fields with a flashlight until dawn, convinced they would eventually find Daniel Mercer hiding somewhere injured, confused, maybe lost. But Daniel Mercer had never appeared. The years had moved on. Keller moved to other cases, other cities, other tragedies. Yet every so often the Mercer file crept back into his mind, usually late at night when sleep wouldn't come. Something about it had always bothered him. Not just the disappearance, not just the empty truck. Something smaller. Something he couldn't quite name. When Keller retired in 2021, he expected the Mercer case to fade like so many others. But instead, the opposite happened. With time finally on his side, he began revisiting old investigations that had never been solved. He read through stacks of files the way some people reread old novels, searching for patterns that younger detectives might have missed. And eventually, the Mercer file found its way back into his hands. At first glance, nothing had changed. The timeline remained painfully simple. Daniel Mercer left the auto shop at 9:40 p.m. His truck was found abandoned on County Road 17 shortly after 11. Wallet in the seat. Keys in the ignition.
Door open.
No body. No witnesses. No suspect. Keller flipped slowly through the pages, his eyes scanning faded photographs and handwritten notes from detectives who had long since retired or passed away. Crime scene diagrams. Search grid maps. Interview transcripts. Then he stopped. One line in the original incident report caught his attention. Not because it was dramatic.
Because it was ordinary.
A deputy had written that when they first arrived at the truck, the interior light was still on. Most people wouldn't think twice about that detail. Car doors open, lights on, perfectly normal. But Keller had spent decades reconstructing crime scenes, and something about that detail didn't sit right. Interior lights in trucks like Daniel's didn't stay on forever. They shut off automatically after a few minutes to preserve the battery. Yet the responding deputies had arrived more than an hour after Daniel supposedly left the garage. The light should have been off. Unless the door had been opened much later. Keller leaned back in his chair. For 25 years, investigators had assumed Daniel Mercer stopped his truck on that road sometime shortly after leaving work. But what if that assumption was wrong? What if Daniel Mercer had driven somewhere else first and only ended up on County Road 17 much later? That possibility shifted the entire timeline. And if the timeline was wrong, then every theory built around it might be wrong too. Keller returned to the file with renewed focus. He reviewed every interview from the original investigation. Most were routine, neighbors, co-workers, family members repeating the same statements they had given decades earlier. Daniel had no known enemies, no debts, no history of violence. But buried deep in the interview transcripts, Keller found something investigators in 1997 had apparently dismissed. A brief conversation with a gas station clerk. The clerk worked the night shift at a small station just outside Millbrook. According to the transcript, he believed he might have seen Daniel Mercer sometime after 10:30 p.m. But investigators never confirmed it. At the time, the sighting had seemed unlikely. Daniel was supposed to be driving straight home, so detectives had moved on. Keller stared at the transcript for a long time. If the clerk was right, Daniel Mercer was still alive nearly an hour after leaving the auto shop, which meant something happened between that gas station and County Road 17. Keller drove to Millbrook the next morning. The town looked almost exactly as he remembered. The same diner on Main Street, the same faded storefronts, the same quiet sidewalks that seemed to hold onto every memory that ever passed through them. The gas station was still there too. Different owners now. New paint. Brighter lights. But the layout hadn't changed. Keller stepped inside and asked the young cashier if anyone remembered the old night clerk from the 1990s. The cashier shrugged. Old guy named Raymond used to work here, she said. Retired years ago. Keller tracked Raymond down 2 towns over. The former clerk was now in his 70s, living in a small ranch house filled with fishing gear and old sports magazines. When Keller mentioned Daniel Mercer's name, Raymond frowned. Then something surprising happened. He remembered. Not clearly, not perfectly, but enough. Raymond told Keller that the night Daniel disappeared, a green pickup truck had pulled into the station late, sometime after 10:30, maybe closer to 11. The driver looked nervous, restless. He bought a soda and stood near the door like he was waiting for someone. Then another vehicle arrived. Raymond couldn't remember the make, but he remembered the headlights switching off before the car reached the pumps. Just like the farmer's story from 1997. A car driving in the dark without headlights. Raymond said the 2 drivers spoke briefly outside. Too quietly for him to hear. But he remembered one strange detail. The second driver never got out of the car. Daniel Mercer approached the passenger window instead. And then, both vehicles left, driving in the same direction, toward County Road 17. Keller felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. Because if Raymond's memory was accurate, Daniel Mercer hadn't been alone when he reached that empty road. He had followed someone there. Voluntarily. which meant Daniel likely knew the person inside that second car. And suddenly, the Mercer disappearance no longer looked random. It looked personal. Keller returned to the sheriff's department with a growing sense of urgency. He requested the original evidence boxes from storage. Most were ordinary items: Daniel's wallet, the glove found near the river, photographs from the search area. But inside one box, Keller found something investigators in 1997 had never been able to fully analyze: a cigarette butt recovered from the ground near Daniel's truck. Back then, DNA technology had been primitive. Testing had revealed nothing useful. But 25 years later, the science had changed. Modern forensic labs could extract DNA from the smallest trace of saliva, even from a decades-old cigarette filter. Keller convinced the department to submit the evidence for new testing. The results would take weeks. And during those weeks, Keller returned again and again to Millbrook, quietly re-examining the people who had been part of Daniel Mercer's life. Old coworkers, former neighbors, friends who had drifted away over the years. One name surfaced repeatedly in old notes and casual conversations: a man named Stephen Harrow. Back in 1997, Harrow had worked part-time at the same auto shop as Daniel Mercer. He wasn't close with Daniel, but they knew each other. More importantly, Harrow owned a dark sedan at the time, a sedan several witnesses had vaguely mentioned during the early investigation. Back then, the lead had gone nowhere. Harrow had an alibi. He told detectives he was home that night watching television. No one could confirm it, but there was no evidence to contradict him either. So investigators had moved on. But Keller couldn't shake the possibility. If Daniel met someone at the gas station, if that person drove with their headlights off, if Daniel followed that person to County Road 17, then the truth might have been sitting in Millbrook all along, hidden inside a simple explanation no one had ever challenged. And then the lab results arrived. The DNA from the cigarette butt had finally produced a profile. When it entered the national database, investigators expected nothing. After 25 years, cold cases rarely delivered miracles. But this one did. The system returned a match: a man who had been arrested 2 years earlier in another county for assault. His name appeared on the lab report like a ghost from the past. Stephen Harrow, the same man who had worked beside Daniel Mercer in 1997. The same man who claimed he had spent that night alone at home. And suddenly, after 25 years of silence, the Mercer cold case was no longer just a mystery. It was an investigation again. An investigation that was about to shake the quiet town of Millbrook in ways no one had imagined. The name sat on the lab report like a match dropped into dry grass: Stephen Harrow. For 25 years, the Mercer disappearance had been nothing but unanswered questions and fading memories. Now, suddenly, there was something real: DNA pulled from a cigarette butt lying near Daniel Mercer's abandoned truck. A cigarette that investigators in 1997 had never been able to link to anyone. And now it had a name. Keller read the report 3 times, each pass slower than the last, as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something less explosive. But they didn't. The results stayed the same. Stephen Harrow, a man who had already been questioned during the original investigation. A man who had worked in the same garage as Daniel Mercer. A man who had claimed he spent the night of October 12, 1997 alone at home. Back then, there had been nothing tying him to the scene. Now there was DNA sitting 20 feet from Mercer's truck. And that changed everything. But Keller understood something younger detectives often forgot. A DNA match didn't automatically solve a case. It opened a door, but what waited behind that door still had to be proven step by careful step. Because if investigators rushed in, if they pushed too hard without the right evidence, the case could collapse before it ever reached a courtroom. And after 25 years, the last thing anyone wanted was another dead end. Keller drove back to Millbrook the same afternoon. The town looked the same as always: quiet streets, faded storefronts, the steady hum of small-town life that never seemed to change. But Keller knew something the people walking those sidewalks didn't. The Mercer case was alive again. And somewhere in or around this quiet town lived a man whose DNA had just appeared at the center of a decades-old disappearance. Stephen Harrow was 54 years old now. He lived 40 miles away in a small rental house near Columbus, working odd construction jobs and keeping mostly to himself. According to public records, he had moved away from Millbrook in the early 2000s, drifting from town to town over the years before eventually settling into a quiet routine. On paper, he looked ordinary. But Keller had seen enough suspects over the years to know something important. Ordinary people sometimes carried extraordinary secrets. The original 1997 interview with Harrow was still preserved in the case file, a short transcript from a conversation held 2 days after Mercer vanished. At the time, detectives had simply been canvassing employees at the auto shop. The interview had lasted barely 20 minutes. Harrow told investigators he left work around 6 that evening. He went home, watched television, and went to bed early. He said he barely knew Daniel Mercer. Nothing unusual. Nothing suspicious. Just another witness with nothing useful to add. But Keller noticed something subtle in the transcript. One line. One tiny detail investigators had never followed up. When asked if he had seen Daniel that night, Harrow said no. But then he added something strange. He mentioned seeing Daniel earlier that week arguing with someone in the shop parking lot. Back in 1997, detectives had assumed Harrow meant a customer or maybe another mechanic. They never pressed him to identify the person. Now Keller read that line again and again. Because if Harrow really saw Daniel arguing with someone, why didn't he describe the person? Why didn't investigators ask? And more importantly, why mention the argument at all? Sometimes suspects reveal themselves not through lies, but through the information they volunteer. Keller reopened the early interview logs. He tracked down every person who had been working at the garage in October of 1997. Most had moved on long ago. Some had passed away, but a few were still alive. One of them was Marcus Donnelly, the co-worker who had been the last confirmed person to see Daniel Mercer alive. Marcus was older now, his hair gray, his hands still stained with the permanent grime that comes from decades of mechanical work. He ran a small repair shop outside Millbrook and seemed surprised when Keller walked through the door holding an old case file. At first, Marcus assumed Keller was just asking routine questions. Then Keller mentioned Stephen Harrow. And something shifted in Marcus's expression. A hesitation. A brief flicker of discomfort. Keller noticed it instantly. Marcus wiped his hands on a rag and leaned against the workbench. "You said Harrow?" he asked. Keller nodded. Marcus exhaled slowly. "Well, that's a name I haven't heard in a long time." Keller didn't interrupt. Silence often pulled out more truth than questions. Marcus stared across the garage for a moment before continuing. "Back then, Harrow was kind of a strange guy," he said. "Didn't talk much. Kept to himself. But him and Daniel, they had problems." That was new. The original investigation files described no serious conflict between the two men. Keller leaned forward slightly. "What kind of problems?" Marcus hesitated again. "Money mostly," he said. At least that's what it sounded like. The story came out slowly. In the weeks before Daniel disappeared, several employees had overheard arguments between Daniel Mercer and Stephen Harrow behind the garage. The arguments weren't loud enough to draw attention from customers, but they happened often enough that people noticed. According to Marcus, Harrow had borrowed money from Daniel months earlier. A few $100s. Not a fortune, but enough to matter. Harrow kept promising to pay it back. Then he stopped talking about it altogether. Daniel, stubborn as ever, started pushing harder for the money. And that's when the argument started. Keller felt a cold clarity settling into the case. Because suddenly the pieces were shifting into a pattern. 2 co-workers. A financial dispute. A late-night meeting at a gas station. And now, DNA at the scene where Daniel Mercer vanished. But Keller needed more. He asked Marcus one final question. "When was the last time you saw them arguing?" Marcus didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down at the rag in his hands, twisting it slowly. "Night Daniel disappeared," he said quietly. The words hung in the air like a crack in glass. Marcus explained that just before closing the garage that evening, He had stepped outside for a cigarette. From the back of the lot, he heard voices near the side of the building. Daniel Mercer and Stephen Harrow. The conversation was tense.
Short.
Marcus couldn't hear every word, but he clearly heard Daniel say something that stuck in his memory all these years.
Tonight, Daniel said.
Either you fix this tonight, or I take it to the sheriff. At the time, Marcus didn't think much of it. Workplace arguments happened. People cooled off. Life moved on. But then Daniel vanished. And suddenly the argument didn't seem so ordinary anymore. Keller left the garage with the uneasy feeling that the truth had been hiding just beneath the surface all along. Back in 1997, investigators had been looking for strangers.
Kidnappers.
Random violence. But sometimes the answer was far simpler. Sometimes the person responsible wasn't a stranger passing through town. Sometimes he was someone who worked beside you every day. Someone who knew exactly when you left work. Exactly which road you drove home. Exactly how to arrange a meeting without raising suspicion. Keller drove back to the sheriff's department and laid out the new evidence in front of the detectives now assigned to the reopened case. The timeline was finally starting to make sense. Daniel argues with Harrow at the garage. Later that night, Daniel meets someone at the gas station. The two vehicles leave together. Hours later, Daniel's truck appears abandoned on County Road 17. And nearby a cigarette carrying Harrow's DNA. It wasn't proof of murder, but it was enough to reopen the investigation officially. For the first time in 25 years, detectives prepared to speak with Stephen Harrow again. This time with evidence. This time with questions he might not be able to answer. And somewhere out there, whether he realized it yet or not, Stephen Harrow's quiet life was about to collide with a past he thought had been buried forever. Because the Mercer case wasn't just a cold file anymore. It was a storm gathering momentum. And after decades of silence, the truth was finally starting to move. By the time investigators began preparing to question Stephen Harrow again, winter had settled over Ohio like a gray curtain. Snow lined the edges of highways, and the quiet towns scattered across the countryside looked frozen in time. The same storefronts, the same streetlights glowing over empty roads at night. But inside the sheriff's department, the Mercer case was moving again after decades of silence. Detectives spread the evidence across a long conference table. Photographs from 1997. Crime scene diagrams. Witness statements. And now, sitting at the center of it all like a silent accusation, the new forensic report linking Stephen Harrow's DNA to the cigarette found beside Daniel Mercer's abandoned truck. For 25 years, the investigation had chased ghosts. Now, finally, there was a person at the center of the storm. But Keller knew something important about cold cases. Suspects had years to perfect their stories. Memories faded. Witnesses disappeared. Evidence grew fragile. If they approached Harrow too aggressively, he might shut down completely. So the plan was simple. Start slow. Let him talk. Because people who believe they got away with something often make one crucial mistake when confronted years later. They talk too much. Stephen Harrow was living in a modest one-story house on the edge of a small town outside Columbus. The neighborhood was quiet, a cluster of aging homes surrounded by leafless trees and narrow streets that seemed permanently dusted with gravel and winter salt. When detectives knocked on the door that afternoon, Harrow answered almost immediately. He looked older than the photographs in the 1997 file, heavier, gray at the temples, his face marked with the deep lines of someone who had spent years working outdoors. For a brief moment, when he saw the badges, something flickered in his eyes. Not panic, but recognition. Like a man who instantly understood that the past had just arrived on his doorstep. Detective Keller spoke first. Stephen Harrow? Harrow nodded slowly.
Yeah.
Keller held up his badge. We're with the county sheriff's office. We'd like to ask you a few questions about Daniel Mercer. The name hung in the cold air between them. For a second, Harrow said nothing. Then he stepped aside and opened the door wider. Sure, he said. Come in. Inside, the house was quiet and sparsely furnished. A worn couch, an old television humming quietly in the corner, a small kitchen table near the window. The place had the feeling of someone who lived alone and preferred it that way. Harrow sat across from the detectives, folding his arms loosely. I already talked to the police about Daniel, he said. That was, 20 years ago? 25, Keller replied. Harrow shrugged. Well, I don't know what else I can tell you. Keller studied him carefully. Cold case interviews were delicate. Push too soon, and the suspect retreats. Move too slowly, and they control the conversation. So Keller began with something simple. Walk us through that day again, he said. October 12th, 1997. Harrow leaned back slightly. For a moment he stared at the ceiling as if pulling old memories from somewhere deep in his mind. I worked the early shift, he said. Left the garage around 6. Went home. Watched TV. Went to bed. The same story he had told detectives 25 years earlier.
Clean. Simple.
Too simple. Keller nodded slowly. Did you see Daniel that day? Harrow shrugged. Maybe for a minute. Just at work. Nothing special. Keller slid a photograph across the table. It showed Daniel Mercer's pickup truck sitting alone on County Road 17 the night it was discovered. Ever been here? Keller asked. Harrow glanced at the photo. Nope. The answer came quickly. Almost automatically. And that's when Keller placed the lab report on the table. He didn't say anything. He just let Harrow look at it. The room grew quiet. Harrow's eyes moved slowly across the page, then stopped. For the first time since the conversation began, the calm expression on his face cracked slightly. What's this? He asked. DNA test, Keller said evenly. We found a cigarette near Daniel Mercer's truck. Harrow's eyes flicked up. And it matches you. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Harrow leaned back in his chair, staring at the report like a man trying to will the words to disappear. Then he laughed. A short, nervous sound. You're kidding, right? He said. I mean, I smoked back then. Lots of people smoked. Could have been anyone. Keller shook his head slowly. No, he said. It was you. The room seemed to shrink. For a moment Harrow said nothing. Then he rubbed his hands together and exhaled. Look, if I drove down that road back then, I don't remember, he said. It's been 25 years. Keller leaned forward slightly. That's interesting, he said. Because a few minutes ago you told me you'd never been there. Harrow's jaw tightened. The detectives watched the shift happen in real time, the calm confidence beginning to fracture under pressure. I might have driven down it once or twice, Harrow said quickly. People drive around. I don't remember every road I've ever been on. Keller didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into the folder and removed another piece of paper. An old interview transcript. You told investigators in 1997 you barely knew Daniel Mercer, Keller said. That true? Harrow nodded.
Yeah.
Keller slid the document closer. Because several coworkers remember you arguing with him the night he disappeared. The color drained slightly from Harrow's face. That's not what happened, he muttered. What had happened? Harrow shifted in his chair. We had a disagreement, he said. Work stuff. Nothing serious. Money? Keller asked. Another pause. Harrow's eyes narrowed.
Who told you that?
So you did owe him money. Harrow rubbed his forehead. It wasn't a big deal, he said. Couple $100. Did you pay him back? I was going to. But you didn't. Harrow's silence said enough. The room felt colder now. Keller let the quiet stretch out before asking the next question. Did you meet Daniel Mercer the night he disappeared? Harrow shook his head immediately.
No.
Not at a gas station outside Millbrook?
No.
Not on County Road 17?
No.
The answers came fast. Too fast. Keller watched him carefully. Because something about Harrow's body language had changed. The confidence was gone now. In its place was tension, the subtle movements of a man trying to stay ahead of a conversation that was slipping out of his control. Keller closed the folder slowly. Stephen, he said quietly. We're not guessing anymore. He tapped the lab report with his finger. We have your DNA at the scene. Harrow looked at the paper again. His breathing had become slower now. Measured. The way people breathe when they're trying to think their way out of a corner. You're telling me a cigarette proves I killed somebody? He asked. No, Keller said. But it proves you were there. Harrow leaned forward, his voice sharper now. Or maybe someone picked up my cigarette somewhere and dropped it there. Keller held his gaze. Then you won't mind explaining why witnesses saw you arguing with Daniel Mercer hours before he vanished. The room went silent again. For a long time, Harrow didn't speak. Outside, a car passed slowly down the quiet street. Finally, Harrow leaned back and crossed his arms. You don't have anything, he said quietly. Keller didn't argue, because suspects often mistook patience for weakness. But Keller had spent decades watching cases unfold. He knew something Harrow didn't. The investigation had only just begun. And the deeper detectives looked into the past, the more cracks they were beginning to see. Cracks in old alibis. Cracks in old stories. Cracks that suggested the truth about what happened to Daniel Mercer on that cold night in 1997 might finally be surfacing. And when it did, the quiet life Stephen Harrow had built over the last 25 years might collapse in a single moment. Stephen Harrow watched the detectives leave his house without another word. The door closed slowly behind them, the soft click of the latch echoing through the quiet living room. For several seconds, he didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the door as if expecting the knock to return. But the street outside stayed silent. No sirens. No patrol cars waiting at the curb. Just winter wind sliding between the houses and the distant rumble of traffic somewhere beyond the neighborhood. Harrow walked back to the kitchen table and sat down heavily. The lab report still burned in his mind like a bright light that refused to fade. DNA. A cigarette from 25 years ago. For decades, he had lived under the comfortable belief that whatever happened in 1997 had disappeared with time. Evidence faded. Memories weakened. People forgot. That was the nature of cold cases. Or, at least, that's what he had always believed. Across town, the detectives were already moving. Keller sat in the passenger seat of the unmarked sedan as it rolled through afternoon traffic toward the sheriff's office. Beside him, Detective Ramirez flipped through notes from the interview. What do you think? Ramirez asked. Keller stared out the window for a moment before answering. He's scared, Keller said. You could see it. Ramirez nodded. He lied about the road immediately. Exactly, Keller replied. And once we showed him the DNA, everything started shifting. Ramirez leaned back in his seat. But he didn't confess. Keller shook his head slowly.
No.
Then he added something that sounded almost like a quiet promise. But people like Harrow, they rarely crack the first time. Back at the department, the investigation expanded quickly. Cold cases had a strange rhythm. For years they moved at a crawl, paperwork, old leads, fading memories. But once a new piece of evidence appeared, the pace could change overnight. Suddenly, there were new search warrants to prepare. Old records to revisit. Witnesses to track down. Every detail from 1997 was pulled back under the microscope. And one by one, the pieces began shifting into place. The first breakthrough came from something surprisingly simple. Vehicle records. Back in 1997, Stephen Harrow owned a dark blue 1989 Chevrolet sedan. Investigators at the time had noted the car, but never considered it significant. Now the detail carried new weight. Because two different witnesses from the original case had ascribed seeing a dark sedan near Daniel Mercer's truck the night he vanished. At the time, those descriptions were vague. Rural roads saw occasional traffic, and detectives couldn't link any specific vehicle to the scene. But now, revisiting the reports with Harrow as a potential suspect, the detail suddenly looked different. Keller requested archived registration records. The information confirmed what he suspected. Stephen Harrow's sedan had been registered less than 2 miles from County Road 17 in October of 1997. Even more interesting, the car had been sold just weeks after Mercer disappeared. The timing raised eyebrows across the investigation team.
Cars get sold all the time.
But selling a vehicle shortly after it might have been near a crime scene that was a detail worth digging into. Ramirez tracked down the buyer. A retired farmer named Leonard Brooks, who still lived outside Millbrook. When detectives visited Brooks, the elderly man welcomed them into a living room filled with old photographs and hunting trophies. He listened carefully as Keller explained why they were there. Then Brooks nodded slowly. "I remember that car," he said. "You do?" "Sure," Brooks replied. "Bought it cheap. Guy said he needed the money." "Stephen Harrow?" "That's the name." Keller leaned forward slightly. "Did he say why he was selling it?" Brooks shrugged. "Something about moving away. Said he didn't want the car anymore." That alone might not have meant much. But then Brooks added something unexpected.
"He was in a hurry," the old man said.
"What kind of hurry?" Ramirez asked. Brooks scratched his chin, thinking back through the years. "Cleaned the car out before I picked it up," he said. "Told me he'd already vacuumed it and wiped everything down." The room grew quiet. Ramirez exchanged a glance with Keller. "Wiped everything down?"
Keller asked.
Brooks nodded. "Interior, dashboard, everything." In 1997, that might have seemed like nothing more than someone preparing a car for sale. But now, with DNA evidence tying Harrow to the disappearance of Daniel Mercer, the detail felt different. Too careful. Too deliberate. As if someone had been trying to erase something. Back at the department, detectives began assembling a clearer picture of Stephen Harrow's life in the weeks surrounding Mercer's disappearance. And the more they looked, the stranger things became. Financial records revealed Harrow had been struggling in 1997. Late rent payments, overdue credit card bills, small personal loans that never seemed to get repaid. Then came another discovery. 2 days before Daniel Mercer vanished, Harrow had withdrawn nearly all the cash from his bank account.
Not a large amount,
but enough to raise questions. Where did that money go? Why withdraw it right before the night Mercer disappeared? Keller stared at the timeline pinned across the investigation board. October 10th. Harrow empties his bank account. October 12th. Daniel Mercer disappears. October 30th. Harrow sells his car. The pattern felt like more than coincidence. But there was still a problem. No body. Without Daniel Mercer's remains, proving murder would be incredibly difficult. Even with DNA. Even with suspicious behavior. They needed something stronger. Something that connected Harrow not just to the scene but to whatever happened after Daniel Mercer stepped out of that truck. Days later, the next piece arrived unexpectedly. A phone call from a woman named Lisa Trent. She had seen a news segment about the reopened Mercer investigation and contacted the sheriff's office. At first, she sounded uncertain, almost nervous. "I'm not sure if this matters," she told detectives. "But I used to know Stephen Harrow." Lisa explained that in the late 1990s, she had dated Harrow briefly, just a few months after Mercer disappeared. At the time, she didn't know anything about the investigation. Harrow never mentioned it. But something he said one night had stayed with her all these years. Detectives leaned forward as she told the story. They had been sitting in Harrow's car outside a diner, talking late at night. The conversation drifted toward crime stories, missing persons cases that had been in the news. Lisa remembered joking that criminals always got caught eventually. Harrow didn't laugh. Instead, he said something that felt strange at the time. Something she never forgot. He looked at her and said quietly, "Not if nobody ever finds a body." The words hung in the interview room like a shadow. Lisa admitted she hadn't thought much of the comment back then. But when she later learned about Daniel Mercer's disappearance, the memory began to feel unsettling. And now, with the case reopened after 25 years, it felt impossible to ignore. Keller left the interview room with a heavy feeling in his chest, because every new detail seemed to point in the same direction. Stephen Harrow, a man with motive, a man whose DNA appeared at the scene, a man who had quietly sold his car and left town soon after the disappearance, and a man who once said something chillingly simple. Not if nobody ever finds the body. But Keller also knew something else. Suspicions weren't enough. Cold cases demanded patience. The truth had survived 25 years in silence. If they rushed now, they might lose it forever. So the investigation moved forward carefully, piece by piece. Because somewhere out there, hidden in the long shadow of that October night in 1997, was the final detail that could finally reveal what happened to Daniel Mercer. And when that detail surfaced, Stephen Harrow might finally run out of places to hide. By the time the Mercer investigation reached its 6th week since reopening, the quiet halls of the sheriff's department felt different. Detectives moved faster. Conversations lowered into tense murmurs whenever the case board came into view. Photographs, maps, and timelines now stretched across nearly an entire wall, the past and present pinned together with colored markers and strings that traced every possible path Daniel Mercer might have taken on the night he disappeared. At the center of it all was one name: Stephen Harrow. For 25 years, that name had been nothing more than a footnote in an old interview transcript. Now it sat at the center of a growing storm. But Keller understood something important about cold cases. They rarely cracked open all at once. Instead, they loosened slowly, like rusted machinery forced back into motion after decades of silence. Every new detail came with resistance. Every answer created new questions. And right now, the biggest question remained the same one that had haunted the investigation since 1997. Where was Daniel Mercer? Without a body, the case existed in a strange limbo. Evidence could point toward violence, toward motive, toward opportunity, but without physical proof of what happened to Daniel after his truck appeared on County Road 17, the story still had gaps large enough for a defense attorney to drive through. Keller stood in front of the evidence board late one evening, studying the map again. The road where Mercer's truck had been found cut through farmland and wooded patches before eventually bending toward the old quarry outside Millbrook. In 1997, investigators had searched much of the surrounding area, fields, ditches, the nearby riverbank. But search techniques back then were limited. Technology had changed. Ground-penetrating radar, advanced cadaver dogs trained to detect human decomposition decades old, satellite mapping that could identify soil disturbances invisible to the naked eye. If Mercer's body had been hidden somewhere along that lonely stretch of countryside, modern tools might still be able to find it. Keller turned toward Ramirez. "I want to search the quarry again." Ramirez raised an eyebrow. "That place has already been combed." "In 1997, Keller said, "before half the tools we have now even existed." Ramirez nodded slowly. The quarry sat 3 miles beyond County Road 17, surrounded by jagged limestone walls and patches of dense woodland that had grown thicker with every passing year. Back when Mercer disappeared, investigators had briefly considered the site as a possible dump location but found nothing obvious during their search. Now, nearly 3 decades later, the landscape had changed. Trees had grown, ground had shifted, and secrets buried beneath the earth sometimes stayed hidden longer than anyone expected. The search began on a gray morning under low clouds that seemed to press down over the fields. Deputies cordoned off sections of the quarry while technicians unloaded equipment from trucks, radar units, metal detectors, and 2 trained cadaver dogs pacing restlessly against their leashes. Keller stood at the edge of the gravel path overlooking the pit. The quarry floor stretched wide and silent beneath him, broken only by scattered mounds of rubble and stagnant pools of rainwater. Wind whistled through cracks in the rock walls. A place like this could swallow evidence easily. Too easily. The search teams moved slowly across the ground, scanning grid sections one at a time. The dogs led first. Their handlers watched carefully for changes in posture, sudden stops, shifts in breathing, the subtle signals that trained animals gave when they detected the faint scent of human remains. For hours, nothing happened. The dogs wandered through brush and gravel, noses low to the ground. Technicians pushed radar equipment over the soil, studying monitors that flickered with complex patterns of underground shapes. Most of them were natural, stones, roots, pockets of air beneath the surface. But then, just after noon, one of the dogs froze. Its handler immediately raised a hand. The animal stood rigid near the base of a small hill of loose earth, sniffing the ground repeatedly. The handler knelt beside it. "Possible alert," he called. Keller and Ramirez hurried over. The dog circled the same spot twice, then pawed lightly at the dirt. That was enough. Investigators marked the location and brought in shovels. The soil was hard and compacted from years of weather and erosion, but within minutes the team began removing layers of earth. Each shovel stroke felt heavier than the last. Everyone understood what they might find, or what they might not, because sometimes cadaver dogs reacted to old burial sites that contained nothing but trace biological material, a grave long emptied by animals or shifting soil. Still, the possibility hung in the air. The hole grew deeper. 1 foot, 2 feet, 3. And then the shovel struck something. A dull metallic sound echoed through the quiet quarry. The technicians stopped immediately. Keller stepped closer as the team carefully brushed away dirt with smaller tools. Slowly, a rusted object emerged from the ground.
Not bone.
Not clothing. Just metal. A small rectangular box. The kind used for storing tools or spare parts. Ramirez frowned. That's not what I expected. The box was lifted from the soil and placed on a plastic evidence sheet. Its lid had corroded heavily, the hinges nearly fused shut after years underground. A technician pried it open carefully. Inside was a collection of items wrapped in old cloth. Everyone leaned closer as the cloth was unfolded. The objects revealed themselves slowly. A wristwatch, a wallet, and a driver's license. The name on the license read clearly despite the years of decay. Daniel Mercer. For a moment no one spoke. The quiet inside the quarry felt almost sacred. They hadn't found a body, but they had found something equally important. Proof that Daniel Mercer had been here. Keller stared down at the license photo. A younger Daniel Mercer smiling faintly from behind the cracked plastic card. Someone had buried these items deliberately, hidden them beneath layers of soil where no casual search would ever discover them. Which meant one thing. Whoever placed the box there knew exactly what they were doing. And if the wallet and watch were buried here, then Daniel Mercer had almost certainly been here too. Ramirez exhaled slowly. This just got real. Keller nodded, because the discovery changed the case dramatically. A man's belongings didn't bury themselves in the ground miles away from his abandoned truck.
Someone had put them there.
Someone who wanted investigators to believe Daniel Mercer had simply vanished. Someone who thought hiding a few key pieces of evidence might erase the entire story. But instead, after 25 years, those buried items had done the opposite. They had reopened the door to the truth. And when detectives compared the quarry's location to the original timeline, another detail snapped into focus. The road leading to the quarry passed directly through County Road 17. The same road where Daniel Mercer's truck had been found, which meant that if Mercer had followed Stephen Harrow out of Millbrook that night, and if Harrow had led him down that quiet stretch of road, then the path might have continued all the way to the quarry, to the exact place where Daniel Mercer's wallet and watch had been buried in the ground. Keller stood silently for a moment, letting the realization settle, because the investigation had just crossed a threshold. The case was no longer about a missing man. It was about a crime scene hidden in plain sight for 25 years. And somewhere out there, perhaps watching the news, perhaps sitting quietly in his small house outside Columbus, Stephen Harrow was about to learn something he had never expected. The past had started digging itself back up. The discovery at the quarry changed everything. For 25 years, the Mercer case had existed in a gray area, a disappearance wrapped in speculation, a mystery that hovered somewhere between runaway theories and whispered suspicions of foul play. But the moment Daniel Mercer's wallet and watch surfaced from the soil beneath that lonely quarry hillside, the narrative shifted. Someone had buried those items. Someone had taken the time to hide them carefully, deep enough that no casual search would uncover them. And in the quiet rooms of the sheriff's department that evening, the investigation board was updated with a new label. Not missing person. Homicide investigation. The evidence box containing Mercer's belongings sat under bright fluorescent lights in the forensic lab. Technicians moved slowly, methodically, documenting every detail before beginning the long process of testing. The wallet was stiff from years underground. Dirt clung to its seams. Inside were fragments of paper, a faded grocery receipt, 2 business cards, and the driver's license Keller had seen at the quarry. But something was missing. Money. The wallet contained no cash. Ramirez frowned when he noticed it. Robbery, he asked. Keller shook his head. Daniel's truck was still there. His keys were still there. Nothing else missing. Ramirez leaned back slightly. Then whoever buried this didn't want the money, they wanted the identity gone. Keller nodded slowly. Exactly. If Mercer's body had been discovered somewhere without identification, investigators might have struggled for days, even weeks, to confirm who the victim was. In 1997, identification often depended on fingerprints or dental records, processes that took time. Time the killer might have hoped would blur the connection to Millbrook. But the plan hadn't worked, because Mercer's body had never been found, which meant the real question still hung over the investigation like a storm cloud. Where was he? The forensic team began testing the items immediately. Even after decades underground, modern technology could sometimes recover surprising traces of evidence, microscopic fibers, fragments of DNA, even tiny skin cells trapped in seams or under metal edges. The watch came first. Its cracked glass face was frozen at 9:42. Technicians couldn't confirm whether that time represented the moment it stopped or simply when moisture damaged the mechanism years later. But the detail didn't escape Keller's attention. 9:42 p.m. A time late enough for darkness. Late enough for two vehicles to disappear down a rural road unnoticed. The back of the watch contained another detail. An engraving. To Daniel, keep chasing the horizon. Love, Emily. Keller remembered the name instantly. Emily Mercer, Daniel's wife. The same woman who had spent years begging investigators not to let the case fade away. Keller made the call himself. Emily answered on the second ring. Her voice sounded older now, slower, but the same quiet strength lingered beneath every word. Mrs. Mercer, Keller said gently. This is Detective Keller with the Sheriff's Department. There was a pause on the line, then a soft exhale. I was wondering when you might call. Keller explained the discovery carefully. The quarry, the buried box, the watch and wallet. He could hear the silence growing heavier on the other end of the phone. Finally, Emily spoke. So he was there. Yes. And that means... Keller didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. After 25 years, Emily Mercer understood what the discovery meant. Her husband had not simply vanished. Someone had taken him. Someone had buried his belongings like a final attempt to erase him. And somewhere beyond that quiet quarry hillside, the truth about what happened next still waited to be uncovered. Emily's voice trembled slightly when she spoke again. Do you think you'll find him? Keller looked at the investigation board across the room. The roads. The quarry. The name Stephen Harrow pinned in the center. We're going to try, he said. The search area expanded the next morning. If Mercer's belongings had been buried at the quarry, investigators believed the body might be somewhere nearby. Criminals often chose a single location when disposing of evidence. It reduced risk, minimized travel, and allowed them to act quickly before anyone noticed. The problem was scale. The quarry and surrounding woodland covered nearly 40 acres of uneven terrain. Dense brush, rocky slopes, deep drainage pits where rainwater collected and eroded the soil year after year. A body hidden here in 1997 could have shifted dramatically with time. Animals, flooding, natural decay. Any number of forces could have moved or scattered remains far from their original location. Still, the search teams moved forward. Grid by grid. Cadaver dogs worked the slopes again while radar equipment scanned deeper sections of ground beyond the first burial site. And slowly, investigators began uncovering other clues. Near the ridge above the quarry pit, technicians found old tire impressions preserved beneath layers of hardened clay. They were faint, barely visible after decades, but enough to photograph and document. Two separate vehicles. One larger, one smaller. Keller crouched beside the impressions while technicians worked. What do you think? Ramirez asked. Keller traced the pattern with his finger. The smaller one could be Mercer's truck. And the other? Keller stood slowly. Harrow's car. Ramirez looked out across the quarry. If they both drove here. Then Mercer didn't come here alone, Keller finished, which matched the timeline investigators had begun reconstructing. Daniel Mercer leaves the gas station late that night. Witnesses see his truck following another vehicle. Both vehicles travel down County Road 17. Both vehicles eventually arrive near the quarry. What happens next? That part still lived in darkness. But the ground beneath their feet might finally be ready to reveal it. Later that afternoon, one of the cadaver dogs alerted again. This time deeper in the woods beyond the quarry ridge. The animal circled a patch of earth near a fallen tree, whining softly as it pawed the ground. Handlers exchanged glances. A second dog was brought in to confirm. The result was the same. 2 independent alerts. Same location. Keller's pulse quickened as investigators marked the area. If Mercer's belongings had been buried at the quarry, this second location might represent something far more important. The team began digging carefully, shovels cutting slowly into the frozen earth. Everyone worked in silence. Every handful of soil felt heavier than the last, because if they found what the dogs were reacting to, then the Mercer case would finally move from theory to certainty. Nearly half an hour passed before the first sign appeared. A technician paused suddenly. "Hold on." Everyone leaned closer. Something pale had emerged beneath the soil. At first it looked like a fragment of stone. But as the dirt cleared away, the shape became unmistakable.
Bone.
Human bone. A long, narrow piece, part of a forearm. The forest around them fell completely silent. No one spoke. For a moment the only sound was wind moving through bare branches overhead. Then Keller stepped forward slowly. After 25 years, Daniel Mercer had finally been found. And somewhere, perhaps sitting alone in that quiet house outside Columbus, Stephen Harrow's past was about to collide with the present in a way he could no longer escape. The moment the bone emerged from the soil, the forest seemed to hold its breath. No one spoke. The wind moved through the bare branches above the quarry ridge, carrying the cold smell of damp earth and limestone. Investigators stepped back as the forensic team took control of the scene, carefully widening the excavation around the fragment. Human remains. After 25 years. For decades, the Mercer case had lived in uncertainty. Theories, suspicions, quiet accusations whispered across small-town diners and grocery store aisles. Now the ground itself had finally answered the question that had haunted Millbrook since 1997. Daniel Mercer had not disappeared. He had been buried. The excavation continued slowly through the afternoon. Soil was removed inch by inch using small tools and brushes instead of shovels. Technicians worked with the patience of archaeologists, exposing the fragile remains without damaging them. More bones appeared. First the lower arm, then fragments of ribs, then part of a skull emerging beneath a tangled web of tree roots. The skeleton lay curled slightly on its side, buried less than 3 feet beneath the surface. Years of shifting soil and erosion had scattered some bones away from the main body, but the position still told a story. Whoever placed Mercer there had not dug deeply. They had chosen speed over permanence. Keller crouched near the edge of the excavation while forensic specialists documented the scene. Cameras clicked quietly. Measurement markers were placed beside each exposed bone. Ramirez stood beside him, arms folded. "Shallow grave," he said. Keller nodded. "Probably done in the dark. Or in a hurry." Keller looked across the trees toward the distant quarry pit. The distance between the buried wallet and the grave site was nearly 200 yards. Separate hiding places. Separate decisions. Which meant something important. The person who buried Daniel Mercer here had taken extra steps to scatter evidence, to confuse investigators, to make it harder for anyone to connect the body with the truck left miles away on County Road 17. But they had underestimated one thing.
Time.
Time had slowly shifted the soil, thinned the trees, and allowed trained dogs to detect what human searchers in 1997 had missed. Now the forest had given up its secret, and the Mercer case had crossed the point of no return. By early evening the remains were fully exposed. The skeleton was carefully lifted and placed into protective containers for transport to the forensic lab. Every bone would be analyzed, every fracture studied, Because somewhere within those bones was the answer to the next critical question. How did Daniel Mercer die? As the last evidence markers were packed away, Keller stood quietly at the edge of the clearing. The forest had grown darker, the sky fading into a deep winter blue beyond the branches. 25 years. That was how long Daniel Mercer had waited here, hidden beneath a fallen tree, while seasons changed above him.
Rain.
Snow. Summer heat. All passing silently over the shallow grave while his family waited for answers that never came. Until now. Ramirez approached quietly. You thinking what I'm thinking? He asked. Keller nodded. We're close. Close enough for an arrest? Keller didn't answer immediately, because he knew the difference between suspicion and proof. They had Mercer's remains. They had evidence linking Stephen Harrow to the road where Mercer's truck had been abandoned. They had motive. They had lies from the suspect himself. But a defense attorney would still ask the same question in court. Can you prove Stephen Harrow killed him? That answer depended on the forensic results, now waiting in the lab. 3 days later, the medical examiner called. Keller and Ramirez arrived at the facility just after sunrise. The sterile white corridors of the forensic building felt strangely quiet, almost reverent. Dr. Elaine Porter, the chief medical examiner, greeted them in a small conference room. Her expression was serious. You were right to reopen this case, she said. Keller leaned forward slightly. What did you find? Porter slid a series of photographs across the table. Close-ups of the skull. Several fractures, marked with small number tags. Blunt force trauma, Porter explained. She pointed to a deep crack along the left side of the skull. This injury occurred while the victim was alive. Significant force, likely caused by a heavy object. Ramirez exhaled slowly. Homicide. Yes. Porter turned another photo toward them. This fracture alone could have been fatal. The room grew quiet. After 25 years, the cause of death had finally been confirmed. Daniel Mercer had been beaten to death. Keller studied the photographs carefully. Anything else? Porter nodded. We found additional fractures along the forearm and ribs. Defensive wounds? Ramirez asked. That's our interpretation. Which meant Mercer had fought back. The attack hadn't been quick. It had been violent, personal, the kind of confrontation that exploded in anger rather than calculation. Keller sat back in his chair, because the picture was finally beginning to form clearly. 2 men arrive at the quarry late at night. An argument, a fight, a weapon, perhaps a tire iron, a wrench, something heavy enough to fracture bone. Daniel Mercer collapses. Stephen Harrow stands over him. And in that moment, whatever had begun as a confrontation turns into something far darker. Murder. The rest of the story writes itself. Harrow panics. He drags the body into the woods, digs a shallow grave, separately buries Mercer's wallet and watch to remove identification, then drives Mercer's truck back to County Road 17 and abandons it there, hoping the scene will suggest something else. Maybe a disappearance, maybe a robbery, maybe nothing at all. For 25 years, the plan worked. Until a retired detective named Frank Keller looked at the old case file and saw something that had bothered him since 1997. A cigarette. One small detail left behind on a dark rural road. Now that forgotten piece of evidence had reopened an entire investigation. And it had led detectives all the way to a shallow grave hidden beneath the trees of an old quarry. Keller looked at Dr. Porter. You confident in the timeline? Very, she replied. Based on decomposition and soil conditions, the burial is consistent with 1997, which meant there was no more uncertainty. The victim, the cause of death, the location. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. Stephen Harrow had been the last person seen with Daniel Mercer. Stephen Harrow's DNA had been found near the abandoned truck. Stephen Harrow had lied repeatedly during questioning. And now Daniel Mercer's body had been discovered along the exact route Harrow would have traveled that night. Ramirez looked at Keller. Well, he said quietly, looks like it's time. Keller nodded. For 25 years, Stephen Harrow had lived a quiet life, worked steady jobs, paid his bills, built a routine that allowed him to believe the past was buried as deeply as the shallow grave in the woods outside Millbrook. But cold cases had a way of waiting patiently, waiting for new technology, waiting for a single overlooked detail, waiting for the moment when time stopped protecting the truth. And now that moment had finally arrived. Because somewhere in a quiet neighborhood outside Columbus, Stephen Harrow was about to hear a knock on his door. A knock that had taken 25 years to arrive. The years did not erase the night Sarah Mitchell disappeared. If anything, time sharpened it, like a scar that refused to fade. By the late 2000s, the town of Brookdale, Ohio, had grown quieter about the case, but never comfortable. People still lowered their voices when the subject came up. The words 1997 cold case still carried weight in the local newspaper archives, still haunted the police department's storage room where cardboard evidence boxes gathered dust beneath flickering fluorescent lights. For nearly a decade after Sarah vanished, investigators chased shadows. They interviewed hundreds of people, classmates, teachers, neighbors, truck drivers who had passed through town that night. Every lead arrived with a burst of hope and ended with the same cold disappointment. No weapon. No confirmed suspect. No body. The case slowly drifted into that grim category every detective fears, the ones that refuse to die but refuse to speak. But the story never completely disappeared. Every October, on the anniversary of Sarah's disappearance, someone would place fresh flowers beside the rusted street sign on Mill Creek Road. Nobody ever admitted to doing it. The bouquets appeared silently, overnight, a quiet reminder that the town remembered. And somewhere in the background, the file sat on a shelf marked unsolved. By 2012, the Brookdale Police Department had changed. New officers filled the hallways. New computers replaced the ancient beige monitors that once hummed on every desk. But one thing remained unchanged: the Mitchell file, thick with statements, photos, and unanswered questions. Inside were hundreds of pages. A photograph of Sarah smiling in her cheerleading uniform. A map of the route she supposedly walked that night. Interview transcripts with shaky handwriting in the margins. And one photograph that detectives kept returning to again and again. The parking lot behind the old Brookdale diner. Taken hours after Sarah vanished, it showed a smear of tire tracks cutting across loose gravel. Investigators had photographed it obsessively in 1997, hoping it might reveal the vehicle involved. But the tracks had been partial, blurred by rain before casts could be taken. Another clue that slipped through their fingers. As the years passed, detectives rotated through the department, but the case remained a quiet presence. Every new investigator eventually found themselves opening the Mitchell file late at night, flipping through the pages, searching for something the others had missed. Most found nothing, until one small development stirred the case again. In 2013, a construction crew renovating an abandoned farmhouse just outside town discovered something buried beneath a collapsed porch. It was an old canvas duffel bag, rotting from years of exposure to soil and moisture. Inside the bag were clothes, a pair of jeans, a sweatshirt, and a faded high school gym shirt. The logo caught the attention of one of the workers immediately. Brookdale High. Police arrived within hours. The clothes were taken to the lab. Forensics teams carefully documented every fiber, every stain. The possibilities spread quickly through town like wildfire. Could these belong to Sarah? The lab results arrived weeks later. The clothing did belong to a Brookdale student, but not Sarah Mitchell. The garments were linked to another missing person case from the early 2000s, a runaway who had eventually been located alive years later. Another dead end. But the discovery stirred something inside the department. For the first time in years, investigators began reopening old evidence boxes connected to unsolved disappearances. Files were recatalogued. Physical evidence was retested with modern DNA techniques unavailable in the late 1990s. And that process brought detectives back to the Mitchell case. Back to the diner. Back to the gravel parking lot. Back to the witnesses who had spoken nervously that night. One of those witnesses had always bothered investigators. His name was Tom Grady. In 1997, Tom had been 22 years old, working part-time as a mechanic at a gas station just down the road from the diner. He had been one of the last people to claim seeing Sarah alive. According to his statement, he had noticed her walking along the road around 9:30 p.m., heading toward town. She had waved briefly when a pickup truck drove past. But Grady's statement had always contained a strange detail. He claimed that moments later, he heard the sound of tires on gravel, like a car turning quickly into the diner parking lot. When detectives asked if he had seen the vehicle, Grady said no. He had been facing the opposite direction. The sound had simply caught his attention. At the time, investigators filed the detail away and moved on. Without a description of the vehicle, it meant very little. But years later, as cold case investigators reviewed the file, they noticed something odd. Grady's statement had changed slightly during a second interview conducted 2 days after Sarah disappeared. In the first statement, he said the sound of tires happened after he saw Sarah walking. In the second statement, he said the sound happened before. It was a small inconsistency, the kind that could easily be explained by memory or something else. Detectives tried to locate Tom Grady again. But by 2013, he had moved out of Brookdale. Records showed he had relocated several times over the years, bouncing between construction jobs in neighboring counties. When investigators finally reached him by phone, his response was polite but distant. He said he barely remembered the night. He said it had been years. He said the police had already asked him everything back then. But something about the conversation left investigators unsettled. Because during the call, Grady asked a question. A strange question. He asked whether they had found the body yet. The detective paused. That detail had never been public. The fact that Sarah's body had never been located was known locally, but the phrasing of Grady's question sounded oddly specific. Not yet, the detective replied carefully. Grady went quiet. Then he said something that stuck with investigators long after the call ended. Maybe she left town, he muttered. And then he hung up. The comment lingered like a shadow. Because after 16 years, most people who followed the case no longer believed Sarah had simply run away. But Grady had sounded almost hopeful. Detectives tried to schedule an in-person interview. Grady declined. He said he was busy with work. He said he had nothing new to add. Once again, the trail cooled. The Mitchell file returned to its shelf. Another few years passed. Another generation of officers joined the department.
The town slowly changed.
Old businesses closed. New ones opened. Families moved in and out of Brookdale, many of them unaware that the quiet streets carried the weight of a mystery stretching back to the last century. But one man had never forgotten. Retired Detective Frank Dalton still kept a copy of the Mitchell case file in a cardboard box in his basement. Sometimes, late at night, he would sit at his kitchen table with the pages spread out before him, studying the photographs, reading the witness statements again and again, searching for something everyone else had missed. Because Dalton had always believed the answer was hidden in the details, in a sentence someone overlooked, in a clue that meant nothing at the time. And one winter evening in 2018, while flipping through the file for the 100th time, Dalton noticed something that made him stop cold. A single line in an interview transcript. A detail buried deep in the early investigation. It came from a teenage waitress who had been working at the diner that night. Her name was Kelly Rivera. Back in 1997, she had told detectives something strange. She said that earlier that evening, before Sarah disappeared, a man had been sitting alone in a pickup truck parked near the diner's back entrance. The engine had been running, the headlights off. And when Kelly walked past the vehicle to throw out trash, she said the driver quickly turned his face away. At the time, detectives had asked if she could describe him. Kelly said she couldn't see clearly. But she did remember one thing. The truck. A dark green pickup. With a cracked taillight. And a bumper sticker. 3 faded words printed across the back window. Words that Dalton now read again slowly, carefully, feeling a chill creep down his spine. Because the sticker read, "Support your local police." And suddenly, after more than 20 years, the cold case that had haunted Brookdale began to shift again. Frank Dalton stared at the sentence for a long time, the yellowed paper trembling slightly in his hands under the dim kitchen light. It was such a small detail, almost invisible among the hundreds of witness statements buried in the Mitchell file. A cracked tail light, a dark green pickup, a bumper sticker that read, "Support your local police." In 1997, it had meant nothing. Half the trucks in rural Ohio carried stickers like that. Patriotic slogans, hunting decals, high school mascots. But now, more than 20 years later, the words felt different. They felt heavier. Dalton leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. Memory began crawling back slowly, like fog lifting from a dark road. Because there had been someone in Brookdale back then who drove a dark green pickup. Someone connected to law enforcement. Not a police officer exactly, but close enough. The name surfaced slowly. Mark Ellison. In 1997, Ellison had worked as a county corrections officer at the small jail outside Brookdale. He wasn't a patrol cop, but he moved in the same circles. Same diners, same bars, same weekend softball games organized by the sheriff's department. People in town recognized him as one of the law guys. Dalton remembered the truck, too. A dark green Ford F-150. And now another memory surfaced, sharp and uncomfortable. Back in the early days of the investigation, Mark Ellison had volunteered information to police. He had come forward on his own, saying he had driven past the diner that night while heading home from a late shift. He claimed he saw nothing unusual. Nothing at all. Dalton's heart began to beat a little faster as he flipped through the file again, searching for Ellison's statement. There it was, typed on a thin sheet of paper dated October 14, 1997. Ellison said he passed the diner around 9:20 p.m. He noticed the parking lot looked empty. No people outside. No suspicious vehicles. Just the quiet glow of neon lights in the window. At the time, investigators accepted the statement without hesitation. Ellison was connected to the sheriff's office. A corrections officer. A man with no criminal record. No reason to suspect him. But Dalton now compared that timeline with something else in the file. Tom Grady's statement. Grady said he heard tires on gravel near the diner around 9:30 p.m. 10 minutes later. And Kelly Rivera, the teenage waitress, remembered seeing the dark green truck parked there earlier in the evening with its engine running. Dalton felt the puzzle pieces begin shifting slowly in his mind. What if Ellison had been there longer than he claimed? What if he never left? The retired detective stood up from the kitchen table and walked slowly to the basement shelves where the rest of his old case boxes sat. Dust coated the cardboard lids. Inside were files from decades of police work, robberies, burglaries, domestic cases long forgotten. He found the box labeled Mitchell, 1997, and pulled it down carefully. More photographs spilled across the table upstairs. Crime scene shots. Maps. Interview notes. And one image Dalton had not looked at in years. It was a wide photograph of the diner parking lot taken shortly after midnight on the night Sarah disappeared. The image had been taken from across the road. At first glance, it showed nothing important. Just the gravel lot, empty except for a single parked vehicle near the back of the building. Dalton leaned closer. His pulse quickened. Because the vehicle in the photograph was barely visible in the shadows, but the shape was unmistakable. A pickup truck, dark-colored, parked near the dumpster. The photo quality was poor, taken with a camera from the late 1990s. The license plate could not be read. The details were blurred. But the truck had one visible feature. A bright reflection in the rear light housing. One tail light looked intact. The other looked shattered. Dalton felt a chill slide down his spine. Cracked tail light. Dark green pickup. Bumper sticker supporting local police. He picked up the phone and dialed the Brookdale Police Department. The officer who answered sounded confused at first. "Frank, it's almost midnight. I need you to pull a file," Dalton said quietly. There was a pause. "What kind of file?" Dalton looked down at the photograph again. The Mitchell case. The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. That case still carried weight inside the department. Even younger officers knew the name. "You think you found something?" the officer asked. Dalton hesitated. "I think we missed something." Within days, investigators reopened the case officially. Modern forensic analysts scanned the old photograph digitally, enhancing the image using software that didn't exist in 1997. The resolution improved slightly, just enough to confirm what Dalton suspected. The truck in the photograph was indeed a Ford F-Series pickup from the early 1990s. The cracked tail light was clearly visible. Detectives checked vehicle registration records from 1997. Only 3 residents in Brookdale owned dark green Ford pickups at that time. 2 had already been interviewed extensively during the original investigation. The third name stopped investigators cold: Mark Ellison. By 2018, Ellison had long since left the corrections department. Records showed he moved to a neighboring county in the early 2000s and eventually settled in a small town nearly 40 miles away. Detectives quietly began digging into his background. What they found raised even more questions. In the years following Sarah Mitchell's disappearance, Ellison had been questioned in connection with 2 separate complaints involving aggressive behavior toward women. Neither case resulted in charges, but the reports remained buried in county records. Another detail stood out. In 2001, Ellison sold his green Ford pickup to a scrapyard after what he described as engine failure. The vehicle was crushed shortly afterward. Gone forever. Investigators scheduled a formal interview. When officers knocked on Ellison's door one rainy afternoon in November 2018, he looked older than expected. Thinner, gray hair at his temples. But his eyes sharpened immediately when he saw the detectives standing on his porch. They asked if he remembered Sarah Mitchell. Ellison nodded slowly. Everyone remembers that girl. They asked about the night she disappeared. He repeated the same story he gave 20 years earlier. He drove past the diner. He saw nothing. He went home. But when detectives mentioned the photograph of the truck in the parking lot, Ellison's posture changed slightly. Not panic. Not anger. Just a moment of stillness. A pause that lasted half a second too long. "You're saying that's my truck?" he asked calmly. "We're asking if it could be." Ellison shook his head. Lot of green trucks in Ohio back then. Detectives pushed further. They mentioned the cracked tail light. Ellison shrugged. Taillights break all the time. They mentioned the waitress who saw a truck with the engine running that night. Ellison leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Sounds like she didn't see much. For nearly 2 hours, the interview continued. And through it all, Ellison remained calm, careful, precise with his words. He denied ever speaking to Sarah. Denied being parked behind the diner. Denied knowing anything about her disappearance. But investigators noticed something else. Ellison never asked one question. He never asked why police were reopening the case after so many years. He never asked what new evidence they had. He simply denied everything and waited for the interview to end. When detectives finally left the house, the rain had intensified outside. Inside the car, one of the investigators sat quietly staring at the windshield. "What do you think?" his partner asked. The detective exhaled slowly. "I think he's been expecting this." Over the next year, investigators built their case slowly. Phone records from 1997 were long gone. Surveillance cameras didn't exist back then. But small details began stacking together like fragile dominoes. Witness statements. The photograph. Ellison's connection to the diner. His suspicious timeline. His destroyed truck. And finally, in early 2020, prosecutors made a decision that shocked the quiet town of Brookdale. They believed they had enough circumstantial evidence to move forward. More than 22 years after Sarah Mitchell vanished into the dark along Mill Creek Road, authorities issued a warrant. Mark Ellison was arrested on suspicion of kidnapping and murder. The news spread through Brookdale like wildfire. Neighbors gathered on porches. Local news vans parked outside the courthouse. For the first time in decades, the cold case that haunted the town felt close to an answer. But as the investigation pushed deeper into Ellison's past, detectives began realizing something unsettling. Because the more they examined the timeline, the more it looked like Sarah Mitchell might not have been his only victim. And the cold case that had once seemed like a single disappearance was beginning to reveal something far darker hidden beneath the quiet streets of Brookdale. The morning of the arrest arrived with a cold wind sweeping through Brookdale. The the kind of wind that rattled loose signs and carried the smell of rain across empty streets. By sunrise, news trucks had already begun lining the courthouse square. Satellite dishes rose above their vans like metallic flowers, pointed toward a sky that looked as gray and uncertain as the case itself. For more than 2 decades, Sarah Mitchell had been a photograph on a missing person poster. A face frozen in time. 16 years old, bright smile, cheerleading uniform. The kind of picture people pinned to bulletin boards in grocery stores and slowly forgot as the years slipped past. But on that morning in 2020, her name returned to the front pages. Ohio 1997 cold case breakthrough. Retired detectives tip triggers arrest. The headline flashed across television screens across the state. Mark Ellison sat silently in a holding room inside the county jail, only a few miles from where he had once worked as a corrections officer himself. The same concrete walls. The same metal table bolted to the floor. A place he knew well from the other side of the bars. Now he was the one waiting. Detectives watched him through the glass. Ellison looked calm.
Too calm.
He sat with his hands folded, occasionally glancing at the clock above the door. His expression never changed. No visible fear. No anger. Just the quiet patience of a man who believed he could outlast whatever was coming next. Across the building, investigators laid out the case one more time for the prosecutor. 23 years of fragments. Witness statements. The enhanced photograph of the green pickup truck. The cracked tail light. Kelly Rivera's account of the idling vehicle behind the diner. Tom Grady's shifting timeline. And Ellison's own words, carefully recorded in interviews years apart. Each piece alone meant very little. Together, they formed a shadowy outline of something far more troubling. But there was still one problem. No body. Without Sarah Mitchell's remains, the case rested almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. Prosecutors knew a defense attorney would attack every piece of it. Still, they believed the pattern was strong enough. Because something else had surfaced during the investigation. Something investigators had not expected. While reviewing old police records connected to Ellison, detectives discovered 2 other missing person reports from neighboring counties during the late 1990s. Both involved young women. Both vanished while walking alone near rural roads at night. And both cases had one eerie connection. Witnesses in each location had reported seeing a dark green pickup truck nearby shortly before the disappearances. The truck was never identified. At the time, investigators had assumed it belonged to a passing motorist. A coincidence. But now the coincidence felt different. One case involved a college student named Emily Parker, who disappeared in 1998 while walking home from a late shift at a diner 30 miles south of Brookdale. The second involved Rachel Harmon, a 19-year-old who vanished in 1999 after leaving a friend's house near the county line. Neither woman was ever found. Both cases had long been classified as unsolved. And suddenly, Mark Ellison's name appeared in the background of both timelines. Cell phone records did not exist then. GPS tracking was unheard of. But employment logs showed that Ellison had worked late shifts at the jail on nights that lined up disturbingly close to the disappearances. For detectives, the possibility was chilling. Had a predator been moving quietly through these rural towns for years? Had Sarah Mitchell been the first victim? Or just the first one noticed? Inside the interrogation room, the door finally opened. 2 detectives stepped inside and sat across from Ellison. A recorder clicked on. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then one of the detectives placed a photograph on the table. The enhanced image of the pickup truck behind the diner. Ellison glanced at it briefly. "That your truck?" the detective asked. Ellison shrugged slightly. "Could be anyone's." Another photograph slid across the table. This one showed Sarah Mitchell, taken from her high school yearbook. 16 years old. Bright eyes. Frozen in time. "You ever talked to her?" the detective asked. Ellison looked at the picture for a few seconds longer this time. Then he shook his head.
"No."
The detective leaned forward. "We know you were behind that diner." Ellison said nothing. "We know your truck was there." Still nothing. "We know you lied about leaving." Ellison finally looked up, and for the first time, something flickered across his face. Not panic, not guilt, something closer to annoyance. "You think a blurry photograph proves that?" he asked calmly. The interrogation continued for hours. Detectives pushed every angle. They brought up the other missing women, the witnesses, the timeline, the cracked tail light. Ellison denied everything, calmly, repeatedly, without hesitation. By late afternoon, the questioning ended, without a confession. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited in the cold wind for updates. Inside, prosecutors prepared the next step, a search warrant. Investigators returned to Ellison's property the following day with ground-penetrating radar and excavation equipment. The small house sat on several acres of land surrounded by thin woods and empty fields. For hours, machines scanned the ground. Detectives watched the monitors carefully, looking for disturbances in the soil, looking for any sign that something had been buried long ago. Finally, near the edge of the property behind a row of old maple trees, the radar detected an irregular shape beneath the earth. The excavation team moved in carefully. Shovels cut into the frozen ground. Dirt was lifted away slowly, inch by inch. Every officer at the scene held their breath. If they found Sarah Mitchell's remains, the case would finally have its answer. The hole grew deeper. 3 feet, 4 feet, 5. And then the digging stopped. Inside the pit was nothing but an old rusted metal drum. Empty. The radar anomaly had been caused by discarded farm equipment buried decades earlier. Another dead end. Days turned into weeks. The search expanded across Ellison's property.
More scanning.
More digging. Nothing. No remains. No clothing. No trace of Sarah Mitchell. Inside the jail, Ellison remained silent. His attorneys quickly filed motions challenging the evidence. They argued the photograph was inconclusive. They argued the witnesses' memories were unreliable after 2 decades. They argued the case was built on speculation. And slowly, the courtroom momentum began to shift. Because without a body, without forensic proof, prosecutors faced a dangerous possibility. A jury might not be convinced. Meanwhile, back in Brookdale, the town felt the familiar weight of uncertainty settling in once again. Neighbors who had once whispered about the case now argued over it openly. Some believed Ellison had finally been caught. Others believed police had arrested the wrong man. And somewhere in the middle sat Sarah Mitchell's family, still waiting after 23 years for the one thing they never received. An answer. One evening, long after the courthouse had emptied, retired Detective Frank Dalton stood alone near the edge of Mill Creek Road. The same stretch of pavement where Sarah had last been seen walking in the darkness of October 1997. The wind moved softly through the trees. Traffic passed occasionally, headlights sweeping across the road before disappearing again into the night. Dalton looked toward the diner parking lot in the distance. It had been renovated years ago. New paint, new lights. But the gravel behind the building was still there. Still quiet. Still holding whatever truth had vanished that night. Ellison's trial was scheduled for the following year. The evidence was ready. The witnesses were prepared. But as Dalton stood there in the cold darkness, he understood something that every cold case detective eventually learns. Some mysteries refuse to give up their final secret, even when the world believes it has found the answer. And somewhere out there, buried beneath years of silence and forgotten roads, the truth about what happened to Sarah Mitchell on that October night in 1997 still waited in the dark. Winter settled heavily over Ohio as the months crawled toward the trial. The case that had once lived quietly inside a dusty file cabinet now moved through the legal system with slow, grinding force. Court motions, evidence hearings, legal arguments that stretched for hours over details most people in Brookdale had never even imagined mattered. Outside the courthouse, life continued as it always had. People opened their shops. Kids walked to school. Cars rolled down Mill Creek Road beneath the same gray skies that hung there in 1997. But beneath that routine, something uneasy lingered in the town's atmosphere. Because for the first time in more than 2 decades, the question had shifted. It was no longer what happened to Sarah Mitchell. Now it was something more dangerous. Did they finally catch the man who did it or not? Inside the courtroom during early hearings, Mark Ellison looked almost exactly as he had on the day of his arrest.
Calm.
Quiet. His posture relaxed behind the defense table, occasionally leaning toward his attorneys as they whispered strategy. To anyone watching from the gallery, he appeared less like a suspected killer and more like a man caught in the middle of a long bureaucratic mistake. And that image was exactly what his lawyers intended. The defense strategy was simple and ruthless. Destroy the timeline, discredit the witnesses, and remind the jury that the entire case depended on fragments of memory from a night 23 years in the past. The prosecution, meanwhile, prepared their own narrative. They would show the pattern: the green pickup truck, the cracked tail light, the suspicious timeline, the fact that Ellison's own truck had been destroyed shortly after the disappearance. And the most haunting piece of all, the photograph of the vehicle sitting behind the diner on the night Sarah vanished. But everyone in the courtroom understood the same brutal truth.
There was still no body.
The trial began in early spring of 2021. News stations returned to Brookdale once again. Camera crews stood outside the courthouse each morning, broadcasting updates to viewers across the state. Reporters repeated the same words that had now become permanently tied to the town's name. The 1997 Ohio cold case that shocked a community. Inside the courtroom, Sarah Mitchell's family sat in the front row. Her parents had aged dramatically since the last time the case appeared in public. Gray hair, tired eyes. But they listened to every word as if the next sentence might finally unlock the truth they had been chasing for nearly half their lives. Witnesses began testifying. Kelly Rivera was among the first. Now in her 40s, she walked slowly to the stand and swore the oath with trembling hands. She described the diner as it looked in 1997. The smell of frying grease. The hum of the neon signs in the windows. Then she described the truck. Dark green.
Parked behind the building.
Engine running. Headlights off. She told the jury about the moment she walked past the vehicle carrying a bag of trash. The driver turning his face away. The cracked tail light glowing faintly in the darkness. Defense attorneys attacked immediately during cross-examination. "Miss Rivera," one of them said calmly, "you're telling this jury that you can clearly remember a truck you saw for a few seconds 23 years ago?" Rivera hesitated. "I remember it because the engine was running," she said quietly. "It felt strange. But you couldn't identify the driver?"
No.
"You couldn't see his face?"
No.
"So today, sitting here under oath, you cannot say that Mark Ellison was the man in that truck." Rivera swallowed. "No," she admitted. The defense smiled faintly. The next witness was Tom Grady. His testimony was even more complicated. Grady confirmed that he heard tires on gravel near the diner shortly after seeing Sarah walking down the road. But when prosecutors pressed him about the timeline differences in his earlier statements, the defense quickly jumped in. "Mr. Grady, would you agree that memories fade over time?" "Yes." "And it's possible you were mistaken about the exact order of events back then?" Grady shifted uncomfortably in the witness chair. "I guess that's possible." Each witness chipped away at the puzzle. But none delivered the decisive blow the prosecution needed. Then came the photograph. The image of the pickup truck behind the diner appeared on a large screen inside the courtroom. Jurors leaned forward. The prosecutor explained the enhancement process used by modern forensic analysts. The shape of the truck, the cracked tail light, the approximate model year. And then he revealed the registration records. Only 3 residents in Brookdale owned similar trucks in 1997. 2 had solid alibis. The third was Mark Ellison. For a moment, the courtroom grew completely silent. But the defense quickly struck back. Their expert witness, a forensic imaging specialist, explained that the photograph was too blurry to definitively identify the truck's make, model, or owner. "Could it be a Ford pickup?" the defense attorney asked. "Yes." "Could it also be a Chevrolet?" "Possibly." "A Dodge?" "Yes." In other words, the attorney concluded, This photograph could represent thousands of vehicles in Ohio during 1997. The expert nodded. Yes. Day after day, the case unfolded like that. A step forward, a step backward. By the third week of testimony, it became clear to everyone watching that the trial would not produce the neat, cinematic resolution people hoped for. There were too many gaps, too many years, too many pieces missing from the story. And then something unexpected happened. One afternoon, prosecutors revealed a new piece of evidence that had not been publicly discussed before the trial. During a renewed search of Ellison's former property months earlier, investigators discovered a small object buried beneath a rotting shed foundation.
It was a piece of plastic, cracked,
faded, the shape of a tail light lens. Forensic testing confirmed it belonged to a 1992 Ford F-150, the same model Ellison owned in 1997. The courtroom stirred with whispers. But once again, the defense responded quickly. There is no evidence this taillight piece was broken during the time of the alleged crime, the defense attorney argued, and no evidence linking it to Sarah Mitchell's disappearance. Still, the discovery hung in the air like a shadow, because now, the broken tail light described by the waitress, the truck in the photograph, and the fragment buried on Ellison's property, all pointed in the same direction, but still not strongly enough. Weeks later, closing arguments arrived. The prosecutor stood before the jury and spoke quietly. For 23 years, he said, a young girl vanished from this town. Her family has waited every day for answers. The evidence you have seen shows a man who lied about where he was, whose truck was seen at the scene, whose vehicle had the exact damage described by witnesses, and who destroyed that truck shortly afterward. He paused. You may never know every detail of what happened that night, but the law does not require perfection. It requires truth. Then the defense attorney rose. He looked at the jurors carefully. This case, he said slowly, is built on guesses, blurry photographs, fading memories. Not a single piece of evidence proves that Mark Ellison ever touched Sarah Mitchell. He let the silence stretch across the room. Ladies and gentlemen, suspicion is not proof. And after 23 years, the truth is still missing. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Inside the courthouse, tension thickened with every passing hour. Outside, reporters waited once again beneath the cold Ohio sky. And in the quiet streets of Brookdale, people waited for something they had been chasing since the fall of 1997. Closure. But as the jury finally returned to the courtroom and the foreperson stood to deliver the verdict, one truth remained painfully clear. No matter what the decision would be, the mystery that began on a dark road along Mill Creek would never fully disappear. Because some cold cases do not end when the trial begins. Sometimes, they only grow deeper. And somewhere in the shadows of that October night, the final piece of Sarah Mitchell's story still remained hidden, waiting to be found. The courtroom felt smaller on the afternoon the jury returned. The benches were packed, the air thick with whispers and quiet breaths. For 3 days, the 12 jurors had disappeared behind a closed door, carrying with them the weight of 23 years of questions. Outside the courthouse, television vans still lined the street, their antennas aimed toward the sky as reporters rehearsed the same sentence again and again. The verdict in the 1997 Brookdale cold case. Inside the courtroom, Mark Ellison sat motionless beside his attorneys. His posture had not changed since the trial began weeks earlier.
Calm, controlled.
His hands rested loosely on the table, as if the outcome had already been decided somewhere far beyond the reach of the courtroom. Across the aisle, Sarah Mitchell's parents held each other's hands tightly. Their eyes had barely left the jury box since the door opened, and the jurors filed back into their seats. The judge nodded to the foreperson. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreperson stood slowly. Yes, Your Honor. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of fluorescent lights. The judge looked toward the jury. Please read the verdict. The foreperson unfolded the paper carefully. In the matter of the state versus Mark Ellison, regarding the charge of kidnapping. A pause. We find the defendant, Another pause that seemed to stretch across decades. Not guilty. The words fell into the room like a stone into water. No gasps. No shouting. Just silence spreading slowly across every face in the courtroom. Ellison did not react immediately. He simply sat there, staring straight ahead, as if waiting for the next sentence. But it never came. The charge of murder carried the same verdict. Not guilty. Because without a body, without direct forensic proof, the jury could not say with certainty what had happened on the road that night in 1997. The judge thanked the jurors for their service. The courtroom began to empty slowly, quietly. Outside, reporters scrambled to broadcast the news. Ohio cold case trial ends in acquittal. Jury finds insufficient evidence after 23-year mystery. Inside the courthouse hallway, Sarah Mitchell's mother leaned against the wall, her hands shaking slightly as reporters' voices echoed from outside. Her husband stood beside her, staring down at the floor as if the ground itself had opened beneath him. For them, the trial had been the final hope. Now the case had returned to the same place it had lived for decades. Unanswered. Across the hall, Mark Ellison stepped out of the courtroom a free man. His attorneys spoke briefly with reporters, repeating the same line again and again. The jury saw what we've said from the beginning. There was never enough evidence. Ellison said nothing. He walked past the cameras with the same quiet expression he had worn during the trial, and it disappeared into a waiting car that pulled away from the courthouse without ceremony. And just like that, the legal chapter of the case was over. But the story itself refused to die. In Brookdale, the verdict did not bring peace. It brought something heavier. Doubt. Some residents believed justice had failed. Others believed the jury had simply followed the law. But everyone agreed on one thing. Sarah Mitchell was still gone. Her body had never been found. And the truth of what happened that night remained buried somewhere beyond the reach of the courtroom. Weeks passed. The reporters left town. The courthouse returned to its quiet routine of minor cases and small-town disputes. But retired Detective Frank Dalton continued to drive past Mill Creek Road from time to time. He would slow the car near the stretch of pavement where Sarah had last been seen walking beneath the dim glow of streetlights more than 2 decades earlier. Every time he passed the spot, the same question returned. What really happened in those final minutes? Because the timeline still left a gap. Sarah was last seen near the diner around 9:30 p.m. Tom Grady heard tires on gravel. Kelly Rivera saw the truck idling behind the building. And somewhere between those moments, a 16-year-old girl disappeared without leaving a single confirmed trace. No scream heard by neighbors. No physical evidence on the road. No body ever discovered in the fields or forests surrounding the town. It was as if the night itself had swallowed her. Years later, investigators would continue to review the case quietly. The Mitchell file remained open. Every so often a new tip would arrive. A phone call from someone who thought they remembered something. A rumor about a man who once bragged in a bar. A hunter claiming to have discovered bones deep in the woods. Each lead was investigated. Each one ended the same way. Nothing. Mark Ellison moved away from the area shortly after the trial. No one in Brookdale saw him again. His name slowly faded from conversation, replaced once more by the larger mystery that had always existed behind it. Because even if Ellison had been involved, the question remained. Where was Sarah? And if Ellison wasn't responsible, then who was? The town itself aged quietly around the mystery. The diner where the truck had once been seen was eventually demolished and replaced with a gas station. The gravel lot disappeared beneath fresh asphalt. Mill Creek Road gained new streetlights and smoother pavement. But the past lingered beneath those changes like a shadow no amount of time could erase. Every October, on the anniversary of Sarah Mitchell's disappearance, flowers still appeared beside the old road sign. No one ever admitted to placing them there. Maybe a friend who still remembered. Maybe a stranger moved by the story. Or maybe someone who knew far more about that night than they had ever told police. Frank Dalton visited the spot once on a quiet autumn evening many years after the trial. The air was cold again, just like it had been in 1997. The road stretched empty into darkness. Cars passed occasionally, their headlights sweeping across the trees before vanishing into the night. Dalton stood there for a long time, thinking about the case, thinking about the photograph of the truck, thinking about the moment when Sarah Mitchell simply vanished from the world. Somewhere out there, the truth still existed, buried in soil, hidden in a forgotten memory, locked inside the mind of someone who had never spoken. Cold cases rarely disappear. They wait. They linger in evidence boxes and newspaper archives and the quiet corners of people's memories. And sometimes they remain unsolved not because the clues are gone, but because the final piece of the puzzle is still missing. Somewhere in Ohio, beneath miles of quiet farmland and dark forests, the secret of what happened on Mill Creek Road in 1997 still waits in silence, waiting for the day someone finally breaks it, or for the day the truth decides to surface on its own. Until then, the story of Sarah Mitchell remains what it has always been: a cold case, a mystery that refuses to fade, and a shadow that still moves quietly through the memory of a small town that never stopped wondering what happened to the girl who disappeared into the night.